Besides the obvious, why did petrol prices just suddenly explode in Australia? Why did oil on global markets suddenly spike and no one seems to have a clear or straight answer? This isn't just numbers on a chart, it's about control, power and failure at every level. Today we're tracing the path of oil from the world's biggest producers all the way back to your local petrol pump. I'll be breaking down the markets, refineries, diesel, agriculture and food prices and expose who's cashing in while Australians and those in other parts of the world are left to pay the bill. Hopefully by the end of the episode you'll see this for what it is. Fuel isn't just a commodity, it's a weapon, and we're the ones it's being used on. Good evening, you're listening to The Truth Tank and I'm your host Tank. If this is your first time listening to The Truth Tank, a big welcome. If you are a repeat listener, welcome back. Alright, got another action-packed, fact-filled episode for you. This episode is going to be part 2 to the Iranian conflict, Operation Epic Fuckery. So if you haven't listened to that, I recommend going back and listening to part 1 to get caught up with what I'll be talking about on tonight's episode. If you can hear rumbling or noise in the background, I do apologise, it is absolutely bucketing down with rain where I am. We've just been hit by a massive thunderstorm. As you can just hear, it seems whenever I record, it's either pouring with rain and a thunderstorm, or it's boiling hot and I am sweating to death in my room. It's pouring down with rain, but I'm still sweating. It's quite humid in my room at the moment. There's not a lot of wind about, it's just pouring with rain and a lot of thunder, which is kind of unusual for this time of year. This time last year, it was like in the high 30s. I think it was like 34, 35, which is unusually high for April. Easter can get a little warm, but not like that. At last year's gather round, it was about 36 degrees on the day I went to see the mighty West Coast play Carlton. That was really brutal because every other year it's been pretty nice weather, high 20s. But anyway, that's getting off topic. As I mentioned, this is part 2 to the Iranian conflict. I'm not sure how many parts the Iranian conflict series is going to be. I'd like to do a deep dive into the background and history of Iran and the conflict and all the power players and the whole long history, but I'm not sure how many parts that will be. I don't think I'm going to run out of things to cover this year somehow. I keep getting sidetracked with things that have happened in the news and around the world. It's frustrating, but it's also interesting. You get to do a deep dive into a current event and really understand it on one hand, but at the same time, it's kind of distracting because I've already got episodes recorded and waiting to be edited, and other episodes I'm working on and writing and researching. So in tonight's episode, we're going to be having a look at the global oil supply and the completely ridiculous situation that is happening globally with the spiking of oil prices. On this episode, I'm going to be covering global oil dependency, Australia's fuel consumption, refineries and importation, transport fuel demand, fuel reserves, farming, fertiliser and agriculture, food transport and supply chains, urban food storage realities, what happens if the fuel runs out, strategic vulnerabilities, who benefits from oil price spikes, and I'll be tying it all together with a historical example, because this isn't the first time the world has had an oil crisis. We'll be looking at the 1973 oil crisis because the world has been down this path before. But enough about that, let's get into tonight's episode. This is episode 97 of The Truth Tank, nearly at 100 already. The Iranian Conflict, Part 2, Oil, Bread and Circus. War starts in the Middle East, and overnight, just like that, petrol prices just seem to spike in Australia and globally. I'll be using Australia for a majority of the examples in this episode, but this applies to everywhere in the world right now. I think every country is basically paying through the nose and arse for fucking petrol. Petrol and oil prices are out of control globally, and it's all to do with this war in the Middle East, or should I say another war in the Middle East. And if you're listening in America, a petrol station is a gas station, and vice versa. We call it petrol, petroleum, gas, gasoline, it's all the same shit. Just replace petrol with whatever word you use for fuel. So in other words, we're paying for oil that hasn't even been pumped out of the fucking bowser yet. Petrol apparently teleports straight from the Middle East onto the service station price board. The fuel underneath the service station was brought weeks ago. So why the fuck are we all paying the future apocalypse price right now? That petrol has been in the country for weeks, it's been brought and paid for, it's been transported, yet the price goes up. This is obvious price gouging and greed because the petrol stations don't give two fucks about their customers. And the government doesn't seem to be able to do anything about it, and when they claim that they are going to do something about it, nothing really seems to get done, and we just go around in this giant circle of fuckery. Petrol in Australia went from $1.55 on a cheap cycle to $1.73. I hadn't filled up since December, since before I saw Avatar Fire and Ash. I was going to fill up when the petrol was $1.55, and then it went up to $1.68, then $1.73. And I thought, fuck it, I'm going to wait for the next cycle. Then the war breaks out, and literally overnight it was $2.20 or $2.15, going up to $2.20 by the end of the week. It spiked at about $1.68, $1.69 for unleaded, and $3, $3.15 to $3.20 for diesel, which is just fucking highway robbery. It's come down to about $2.23 with the ceasefire announcement overnight at time of recording, which is Thursday the 9th of April. But I don't think we are going to see a return to normal petrol prices anytime soon. The petrol stations are making way too much money. They want this war to keep going so they can justify keeping the prices up. And I heard experts, quote-unquote experts on the news this morning say it might take months to years for the prices to return to normal, and this will affect everything. It's kind of fucked that a 5.5 week disruption in oil can have such a devastating effect on a country's economy and oil supply. And that knock-on effect just keeps going and going and going, much like we saw during the pandemic. But I still think it's bullshit. I don't think we're being told the full story. It doesn't seem logical that such a short hiccup in the system can have such devastating effects that last for multiple years. The one I keep coming back to is money. There's a lot of people making a lot of cash off of this crisis. Petrol stations, obviously, supermarkets, investors, oil companies, but more on that later. The government's just got its head up its ass, pretending everything is fine. War is driving the fuel price and the fertiliser price up, which affects the food, and inflation at a time when inflation is already out of control. And that is one of the biggest concerns with this war in the Middle East. It's funny how this war that really has nothing to do with Australia or most of the planet, probably 90% of the planet, it's funny how that has had an effect on the oil supply, fertiliser, food, and is pushing inflation rates through the fucking roof. And look, we'd be facing a massive global recession because of this war. I think it's pretty likely. That's what we're going to be doing tonight. We're going to be following the chain reaction from bombs to petrol all the way back to bread and see where this trail of oil leads. Act 1. Petrol prices and that scam feeling. That's a very loud thunderclap. You'd be mistaken to thinking I was in Tehran recording this with the amount of fucking noise from the sky. That's going to keep up all recordings, so I do apologise for that. If you ask the everyday person why petrol prices just shot through the roof overnight, most people will tell you it's because of the Middle East. They'll point their finger at the missiles, the war, and the chaos, and make a pretty reasonable assumption that's why the price of the Bowser jumped so rapidly. But hold on a second, Australia doesn't even get most of its petrol from the Middle East. So why are we paying apocalypse prices right now? Australia, and as I mentioned in the opening, I'll be using Australia as the example, but you can apply the same logic and methodology to whatever part of the world you're listening in. I'm assuming most parts of the world are having the same problems, but for the sake of the argument, I'll be using Australia as the example. Australia imports most of its refined petrol from big regional refineries in Singapore and South Korea. Australia's petrol was already sitting in huge tankers headed this way, well before any missile was fired at Tehran. Why did the price board at service stations keep going up and up and up? How did some service stations run out of fuel so quickly? As I mentioned before, it's not like petrol can just teleport from Singapore or the Middle East. In other words, it's yesterday's petrol and tomorrow's disaster prices. Global markets don't act like a supply chain. They act like a panic room. The moment a headline whispers conflict, prices seemingly spike instantaneously. But when things calm, prices slowly start to drip back down, if at all. And this is a situation where I don't think prices are going to go down rapidly. I think it's going to be a very slow, quote-unquote, getting back to normal when that new expensive price becomes that new benchmark price. The same way we saw fuel prices spike in the Iraq war. Petrol was pretty cheap, and then that happened, and they went up and up and up and up, and then they crashed and they went up. And then they went down, and it became the quote-unquote new baseline price, where petrol went from under $1 to over $1, and that became the new normal, as the government loves to say. And over the past decade, inflation, conflict, fear makes those prices slowly go up and up and up, and then a situation like this happens, and then prices go right through the roof. I think the new petrol price in Australia, the new low price, will be around the $1.80 mark from now on, until people stop buying it and drive electric cars, but I think that's still a fair way off. But we all know it's the consumer at the end of the day that gets smashed the hardest. The market smiles and nods and tells us this is just how the system works. Well, let's pull back that curtain and have a look at how it actually works. Where Australia's petrol actually comes from. 80% of Australia's refined petrol is imported, primarily from Singapore and South Korean refineries. Only about 10 to 15% comes from Middle Eastern crude, refined locally or imported. Jesus, that is a very loud thunderclap. I haven't had the window rattle like that in a long time. Petrol prices here in Australia are determined not locally but by a benchmark called Singapore MOGAS 95, or MOGAS. That's the international spot price for 95 octane petrol traded in Singapore's huge refining hub. This is probably the same globally, depending on where you get your fuel from. There's probably some type of benchmark for whatever country produces another country's fuel. The The price is quoted in US dollars per barrel and reflects what it costs to buy that petrol on the global market before it ever heads to Australian shores. As of late March 2026, Mogas 95 was trading around USD $125 per barrel, up from 92 USD per barrel a month earlier. That's a 36% spike. Converted to Australian dollars and including shipping, insurance and import taxes, this accounts for a jump of roughly 40 to 50 cents per litre at the bowser before local retail margins. So that's a massive increase in a short amount of time. Future speculation, exchange rate volatility and global uncertainty push wholesale prices up almost immediately. Example, when Brent crude rose 15% in 1 week due to Middle Eastern tensions, the Mogas 95 benchmark surged simultaneously, triggering instant price hikes at terminals. Fuel excise is 48.2 cents a litre plus GST. GST is 10% of the total price. Retailers add site costs and profit margins, typically 5 to 10 cents a litre, meaning the final pump price often reflects global benchmarks before you've even filled the tank up. Those higher benchmark prices show up in Australia within about 1 to 2 weeks, or in this case, 1 to 2 days. Because the petrol prices, as soon as the Iranian conflict started, those petrol prices were up Monday, Tuesday morning. The war started Saturday night here, and by Monday we were getting bent over the fucking bowser and taken for a fucking ride. Retail prices at the pump often jump almost immediately because wholesalers and service stations adjust to protect against future cost increases. And I guess that includes fuel they've already purchased at the lower price and not the new inflated price, but they still pass those increased costs onto the customer, which I think should be made illegal. If you did that at a department store or somewhere and there wasn't a really good fucking explanation for it, there would be a massive public outcry. But when it comes to fuel and food, we just wear the increasing costs. It is bucketing down with rain again. Taxes and market forces. On top of the import cost, every litre includes fuel excise, a government tax, and GST, 10% of the total price, which adds significant costs beyond the import price. So the import price is one thing, and then you're getting fucked with taxes and the GST on top of that. GST, if you don't know, is a goods and service tax. The market, not the government, sets the price Australians pay at the pump, and falls slowly because retailers don't have incentives to rush drops through. No, and why would they? Because they're making a killing. Benchmark and import parity pricing. Singapore MOPS 95, which stands for Means of Platts Singapore, is a spot price for 95 octane petrol, which cargoes typically around 30,000 tonnes and is widely used as the international benchmark for Australian pricing. The import parity price combines the Mogas 95 spot price, US dollars per barrel converted to Australian dollars per litre, with shipping costs, insurance, wharfage, storage, freight and distribution fees to estimate what it should cost on arrival. And I think should cost is the key word. Role of crude oil and exchange rates. Mogas pricing is indirectly linked to crude oil benchmarks, like Brent crude, the raw material that gets refined into fuel. When Brent rises, refiners pay more for feedstock and Mogas follows. Because Mogas is priced in USD, a weaker Australian dollar amplifies costs, even if the USD price hasn't risen. A weaker AUD means more Australian dollars per barrel of Mogas, pushing import parity pricing. The terminal gate price, the TGP, essentially the wholesale cost at the terminal before fuel goes to petrol stations, typically accounts for 90 to 95% of the retail price at the pump once taxes are included. Local retail margins, site costs, rent, wages, and competitive cycles add the remaining difference. Price cycles and competition. In major cities like Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane, price cycles, sharp rises followed by discount troughs, are driven by competitive pricing strategies, not wholesale cost changes themselves. So let's break those numbers down even further. Let's have a more technical look at the numbers. So the TGP, the terminal gate price, It's the wholesale cost at import terminal, typically 90 to 95% of the retail price. The futures impact. Traders speculate on oil to be delivered 1 to 6 months ahead. A sudden geopolitical event, such as the Iranian war, can spike the future price by 5 to 10% overnight, inflating local prices even if supply hasn't changed. Currency effect, Australian dollars to US fell from 70 to 66 cents in late March 2026, adding roughly 2 to 3 cents a litre to import parity pricing. Factor in the price cycles, retail pumps in Sydney and Melbourne often show sharp daily signs of up to 8 to 10 cents a litre, reflecting competitive strategies rather than supply issues. So in other words, it sounds like the fuel is already here, well, we already have enough of it, and these cunts just want to make even more money. Yeah, there is a whole bunch of taxes and fees and all that are being factored into that, but it seems the 8 to 10 cent litre jump in the price cycles is a competitive strategy rather than a supply and demand issue. And obviously the supply and demand, people panic buying petrol because the fuel prices are going to go up, sends the price of unleaded and diesel through the fucking roof, even more than it was predicted to rise. Interesting. It's a very fragile and sensitive market, I'd say. But there's a lot more fees and taxes that go into it than I think a lot of people do realise. Some recent examples of these price spikes. In South Australia, diesel surged to $2.59 AUD a litre. Unleaded climbed to $2.45 a litre. In regional and rural areas, there was an increase of 50 cents per litre higher than capital cities, even without local supply disruption. So in other words, they're just charging because everybody else is. Like the petrol's already there is no supply issue at that current moment, but the price jumps because of this competitive strategy. Makes me wonder if this hadn't have happened and people didn't panic and the petrol stations weren't cunts and they didn't put the petrol price up through the roof, maybe the country wouldn't be in such a panicked state. The knock-on effects of the price increases have been dramatic and really fast too. I was not expecting like the entire country just to shit itself within a week and a half. And it's amazing, especially the trucking industry, how it was affected so quickly by the increase in diesel, because diesel went through the fucking roof. And it's still high. It's over $3 at the moment. Fuel had a knock-on effect with trucking, which has a knock-on effect with supermarkets and deliveries, the construction industry, even electricity. There's a lot of trucking companies that were saying that it's cheaper just to have their fleets of trucks stand down and not do anything, because to run them and to deliver things was going to cost more than they're going to make. And one of the bigger impacts that hasn't made the headlines as much is fertiliser, and that equals hiccups in the food supply. Every spike inflates logistics, manufacturing and agriculture, which directly hits bread, meat and essential goods required for daily living. And that is the real scary thing. What are the long-term effects going to be from the supply chain disruptions? If farmers can't get fertiliser and fuel, how do they sow the next set of crops? Because they're planting winter crops at the moment, is that going to have a disastrous effect in 6 months' time when we hit summer again and we don't have summer crops? What does that look like? Are we going to have a food shortage in this country in the next 3 to 6 months? Because that's what the farmers are telling us, and I don't think the government is taking it seriously enough. And what's the answer going to be? Well, we'll just import food, like the UK was going to do right before the pandemic hit. If you don't have fuel and food security in a country, you are basically fucked. I've never understood putting all your eggs in one basket and relying solely on overseas imports. You need to have certain supply chains and contingencies in your own country. We needed to have a backup fuel reserve, which I'll get into later, a secured food supply. Why aren't we making fertiliser in this country? That's a big one. Why are we importing so much fertiliser from overseas? Why aren't we making it here in Australia? Why isn't there more refineries open? Why weren't the farmers helped before the people in the cities? It seems like the farmers are always getting fucked. They should have had a fuel allowance by the government. They should have had the price of fucking diesel slashed. They are essential to us in the cities and everywhere else in the country living. And I don't think you can just import things from second and third world countries. You have no idea of the quality of food or the pesticides or the fertilizers, which can lead to massive medical issues later in life. We need to have a secure fuel and food supply in this country, as well as medical equipment and medicines. All that needs to be produced in your own country. Europe, US is probably the same story. You have to have these secure supply chains. You can't just rely on one country for paracetamol or ibuprofen or a puffer or whatever it is. One disruption can have a massive and long-lasting effect. And as we've seen in recent weeks, there has been a literal domino effect right around the world. There's been global panic, benchmark spikes, import parities, TGP, pump prices, groceries, and the inflation rate have all risen. It really makes me wonder, is the world economy just one gigantic Ponzi scheme? Because it kind of seems like it. The whole system seems so absurd and so fragile. If one event like this happens and has this global disruption, like you're throwing a rock into a pond and this ripple effect has just gone all throughout the world nearly instantaneously. This didn't quite happen with the war in Iraq. There was a much slower knock-on effect than the war in Iran. I'll make the argument that the global economy is just one giant Ponzi scheme or something that mirrors it very closely. We're paying for fuel that hasn't even arrived. It's priced by traders in Singapore on a Monday, but we get charged on a Tuesday, which spills over into our economy by Thursday. So what are some real examples and recent price spikes? So recent war-linked price movements between late February and mid-March 2026, Australian petrol prices rose rapidly, unleaded up by 31.8 cents, diesel by 40.1. One of the fastest rises among developed nations, linked to global conflict and disruption of tanker routes like the Strait of Hormuz, which, as we all know, is a key oil transit choke point, which goes straight past Iran and is controlled by the IRGC to a point. And that's a whole issue in itself, whether you think the United States should have done more. Maybe in the early planning they should have planned to protect the strait a bit better, because my personal opinion, the United States government is responsible for what is happening in the Strait of Hormuz. They should be providing naval and air cover for the ships going through. But now Iran has capitalized on this and has seen it as an opportunity to make millions of dollars in tolls and revenue by charging the ships, was it $2 million per ship for safe passage through the strait. So the United States government gave a very, very lucrative earning opportunity to the country they had just attacked. Now, naturally, consumers were pretty outraged at the price cycles. Community reports and online discussions show petrol prices rising sharply in local areas. $2.62.9 litres in outer Sydney, even without visible local supply disruption, which hints at pricing driven more by global expectations than immediate physical scarcity. In other words, they're putting the prices up because the entire world is putting its prices up. And I fucking hate that mentality. There's been so many local businesses on the news lately saying, well, we have to increase prices because our delivery drivers have also increased their prices to cover the rising fuel costs, which is fair enough. There is the immediate, we have to charge more because we are using more fuel to deliver the milk to the cafe, the meat to the butcher, whatever it happens to be. But how much are they actually raising the prices? Are they just covering the increased costs, or are they trying to gouge for profit? Because if you're gouging for profit, you can fuck right off. If you are just covering what you are spending in fuel, I completely agree with that. But really, how much can you charge for a small flat white and still say, well, we're only covering the increase in fuel costs? Because there's plenty of cafes around me that are within walking distance of supermarkets. They could probably get a Woolworths or Coles delivery for free if they spend over a certain amount. So does that mean the guy delivering the milk to the cafe, does he lose business because the cafe just says, well, we can't afford to use you anymore? We'll just send the staff out to go pick up 20 litres of milk from Woolworths. Because if I was running a cafe, that's what I'd be doing. If you got free delivery over a certain amount, whether it's $65 or $100, I would be considering it. Because most of those cafes would use hundreds of litres of milk per day. So the real world impacts, obviously, fuel and trucking, every supply chain from supermarkets to appliances moves on diesel. When diesel surges, freight costs skyrocket. Supermarkets and deliveries, high transport costs flow directly into every price on the shelf, which may or may not be even gouged further. Construction and electricity, heavy machinery and power generation relies on fuel. Disruptions raise input costs across the economy. Fertiliser and agriculture, fertiliser production is oil intensive. When fuel spikes, food production costs rise, eventually hitting the bread price. So fuel isn't just a commodity. Judging by the prices we are paying, it's pretty much a Ponzi scheme with wings. It's sold around the world in US dollars, it's priced in fear and landing on Australian bowser boards before Australians even know what hit them. Section 2, War and Oil Markets. Wars happen, missiles fly, headlines scream, and somehow petrol prices jump before a single tank is emptied in the Middle East. Global oil markets responded not to scarcity, but into panic, speculation, and widespread rumours in trading rooms. Take the Russia-Ukraine conflict, for example. When tensions spiked in late February 2026, the Brent crude price rose from $15 to $20 per barrel in just a week, and Australian Mogas 95 instantly jumped from $92 US a barrel to $125 per barrel. Now, did the world suddenly run out of oil? No, it didn't. But fear, derivatives, and speculative trading created a phantom shortage, pushing pump prices sky high. The market isn't about oil, it's about money betting on panic. Derivatives and speculative trading created a phantom shortage, pushing pump prices sky high. The market isn't about oil, it's about money betting on panic. And that should concern everyone, and suggest to me that the whole economic system is based on complete bullshit. It's a fucking Ponzi scheme, but that's just my opinion. So let's get into some facts and stats about global supply basics. So the world produces about 100 million barrels of crude oil per day. The Middle East accounts for 30% of this. Australia imports mostly refined fuel from Singapore, as we've seen. 10 to 15% comes from the Middle East. The international benchmark for Brent crude rose 15 to 20% during geopolitical events. Just in 2026, Mogas 95 in Singapore followed immediately, translating to a 40 to 50% jump in fuel prices at Australian pumps. Futures contracts allow traders to buy and sell oil months ahead. A single panic trade can move millions of dollars and affect prices before the supply ever changes. And this is a huge reason why consumers feel they're getting screwed. There is no actual shortage in Australia. Refineries and stockpiles exist, but the market punishes consumers based on fear, not supply. Prices spike because of speculative premiums, currency shifts, and import parity calculations. That might be true, but I also don't trust the government when they come out and say, well, we have heaps of fuel, we're just waiting for the tankers to get here. Deliveries are on schedule, there's nothing to worry about. But plenty of petrol stations have run out of certain types of fuel. So obviously there is a gap with supply of fuel getting to places it's needed. Regional areas are running out of diesel because it's too expensive for the tankers to refill them. Now, why isn't the government subsidising delivery companies or trucking companies to do this job so we can have this critical supply, so we can get the diesel to farmers who actually need it? Now, the government comes out and says, don't panic buy, don't worry, everything's under control, everything's fine, but we don't have a huge fuel reserve in this country. And if there are further disruptions, I don't think it's going to get better. I think there's a real possibility that Australia will have fuel rationing or run out of certain types of fuel, if not all of them, in the coming months. Because who knows what's going to happen. If we get it from Singapore, what if Singapore says, well, we're going to keep more for ourselves because we need it, or any other country? that could have a massive knock-on effect for Australia, and then we'll be living like Mad Max by about November. Supply versus speculation. Australia has about 50 to 60 days of strategic fuel reserves, far from a crisis level. Despite this, retail prices respond instantaneously to international market signals, not local stock levels. Russia-Ukraine conflict in 2026 is a good example of this. Brent crude went from $85 to $102 a barrel within a week. Singapore's MoGas 95, $92 to $125 a barrel in the same time period. Australia's unleaded price went from $2.05 to $2.45, diesel from $2.19 to $2.59 in less than 2 weeks. The whole situation seems a little bit absurd. Wars happen, oil doesn't, but petrol prices act like the world is ending. Traders are betting on panic, but we're the ones that are paying the bill. Missiles slow down, the futures don't. Welcome to the absurd theatre of the oil market. Global panic, benchmark spike, Australian import parity, the TGP, pump price. All of this amplifies the chain reaction we just looked at in Act 1. Trucking, supermarkets, deliveries, construction, electricity, food, and so on and so forth. And I think the world has been shown a really great example of how war is leveraged and used as an excuse for instant price spikes, even when the actual Australian supply isn't disrupted. This event comes along and then all of a sudden the market starts to go nuts and everyone panics. We don't seem to have learned the lesson from a few years ago. Panic buying doesn't fucking work. Which when Russia did invade Ukraine, was it 4 years ago, I think the petrol price spiked for a couple of weeks, but it wasn't anything like this because obviously, especially in Australia, we don't get any fuel from Russia. That was more of a European problem. But I guess because so much oil, well, 10 to 15% of the oil we do get, which goes through the Strait of Hormuz to Singapore to be refined, which eventually comes to Australia, is affected because of the location of the Straits to Iran. Section 3, refineries, imports and fuel reserves. So let's get real about Australia's fuel reality. 25 years ago, this country made most of its own petrol. We had 8 refineries, we processed our own fuel, but today there's only 2 left, and one is basically on life support. 6 refineries have shut down since the 2000s. Those closures didn't just vanish, they hollowed out our fuel security. Now we scrape together around 10 to 20% of our fuel domestically, the rest we import. And it's the consumer that gets punched in the face when the global market freaks out. Welcome to the absurd theatre of Australian fuel. So the main question is, why did Australia's refineries shut down? About 8 refineries operated in the early 2000s, but most have now closed. BP's Kwinana refinery in Perth was closed and converted to an import terminal due to economic pressures and oversupply from mega refineries abroad. ExxonMobil's Altona refinery in Melbourne closed for similar reasons. Today, only 2 refineries remain, Aviva Energy's Geelong refinery in Victoria and Ampol's Lytton refinery in Queensland. Combined, these produce about 20% of Australia's total liquid fuel needs. So what caused Australia to close all of its refineries except for 2? Global competition from mega refineries in Asia was massive scale and lower costs. Australia's older, smaller facilities just couldn't compete. High operating costs combined with aging infrastructure, limited ability to process diverse crude types and economies of scale working against domestic refineries. As facilities shut, sites were often converted into import terminals instead of refineries. So Australia's fuel infrastructure changed shape but became more import dependent. An import terminal is obviously where they get the fuel in and store it by the sounds of it. So let's have a deeper dive into why Australia's refineries shut down. Because we just scratched the surface. Around the year 2000, Australia produced approximately 800,000 barrels of oil per day, with local refineries meeting nearly all domestic liquid fuel demand. At that point, Australia was often cited as being 70 to 100% self-sufficient. In refined fuel, crude was partly imported, but refining was domestic. Very interesting. So what happened? Where did everything go so wrong? If we were making 70 to 80% of our own fuel from partly imported crude and we were self-sufficient, what the fuck happened? Here's the timeline of major refinery closures. Port Stanvac Refinery in South Australia was the first to close. It was mothballed in 2003 and permanently closed in 2009. Clyde Refinery was next in Sydney. That closed in 2012, followed by Kurnell Refinery, also in Sydney, closing 2 years later in 2014. Bulwer Island Refinery, Brisbane, shut in 2015. Kaiwina, however it's pronounced, refinery in Perth closed and was converted into an import terminal in 2021. Altona Refinery in Melbourne closed in 2021. I'm pretty sure that one was also turned into an import terminal. Each closure removed a domestic node of refinery capacity, pushing Australia further toward import dependency, which, as history tells us, is never a good thing. The economic reality behind the closures. Global competitive pressure. The big story is not that Australia chose to import its fuel, it's that Australia's refineries couldn't compete with massive new refineries in Asia. Countries like Singapore, South Korea, China and Japan built mega refineries with far greater capacity, efficiency and a lower unit cost. Those refineries can leverage economies of scale that Australian facilities never could. In other words, they weren't losing money because Australians are clever, they were losing money because the global refinery game changed. Big facilities in Asia could just make more petrol for far less than the smaller ones domestically ever could. High local costs and structural disadvantages. Australian refineries faced multiple cost handicaps compared to Asian competitors. Small scale and aging infrastructure, older plants with higher per unit operating costs, distant from crude sources, higher shipping costs to import crude into domestic refineries, shallow berths that couldn't take the largest, very large crude carriers, meaning shipping inefficiencies. In other words, it just wasn't economically viable to send a tank all the way to Australia to pick up fuel that doesn't even fill up half the ship. High local costs and structural disadvantages. Australian refineries face multiple cost handicaps compared to Asian competitors. It's going to read out some of these handicaps that contributed to the collapse of Australia's oil industry. So number one, small scale and aging infrastructure. Older plants with higher per unit operating costs, distance from crude sources, higher shipping costs to import crude into domestic refineries. And that is probably one of the biggest ones. It would cost a lot to import the raw materials from Singapore and elsewhere down to Australia to refine. But at the same time, we do have oil here. It's a bit harder to get to, but it's something that Australia never really has looked into as a industry. Apparently in SA there's billions of barrels worth of oil under the ground out in the outback, and yet no one has tried to drill for it because of the environmental laws and some of the logistics. Need for complex refining units for diverse crude grades, which adds capital expenditure, higher Australian wages. That's always an excuse for any type of domestic closure. Occupational health and safety. I can understand that getting in the way because Australia's occupational health and safety is completely over the top. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I don't know. It's probably a bit too strict. And environmental compliance costs, which is another factor in hampering domestic mining for oil. Then regional competitors. A stronger Australian dollar at times made imports comparatively cheaper than running local refining margins. Interesting. Those factors meant the maths simply didn't work. Local refineries couldn't stay profitable in a globalised market. Strategic shifts in energy production. Domestic crude oil production peaked in 2000 and then declined sharply by 40% reduction through the 2000s. This reduced the feedstock available for local refining and made imports even more economical. In other words, less local crude, less internal feedstock, reliance on foreign crude. Once you're importing crude, why not import the overall refined product instead? Cut out the middleman. That sounds logical in tidy economic terms, but when the global supply chain is stressed, logic becomes a nightmare. Policy and market philosophy. Australian energy and industry policy over the last few decades has favoured market-based solutions and low fuel prices over national refining sovereignty. Committees and white papers at times explicitly argued that domestic refining capacity was not necessary. Don't know who wrote those papers, but that's a tough sell for me anyway. I don't buy that for 1 second. If diversified import pathways existed, that philosophy worked great in a stable market until the market wasn't stable. So, what did all these closures leave behind? And what is the current refinery status in 2026? As I mentioned earlier, only 2 operational refineries remain: Viva Energy's Geelong refinery in Victoria and Ampol's Lytton refinery in Queensland. These account for roughly 20 to 25% of domestic liquid fuel needs, which is obviously nowhere near enough. But what about the converted import terminals? The former refinery sites of Kowina and Buller Island now function as import terminals, meaning they store foreign refined fuel but they do not process it. Australia now imports 80 to 90% of its refined petrol and diesel. This reason isn't a sudden preference, it's a squeeze. Small refineries, as we saw, just couldn't compete with the giant mega refineries in Asia. Refineries shut down because they lost money, they couldn't modernise, and they couldn't achieve the scale necessary to survive. When they closed, they were often converted into storage hubs for imported fuel, which also locked in the import dependency rather than sovereign refinery capacity. That's not just a business decision, that's a strategic vulnerability. The government played the short term, save money now, rather than the long-term strategy, which would have been securing a domestic fuel industry and increasing the national strategic fuel reserve, which is not very high compared to other first world nations. This is the part where economics met warfare and decided Australians should just hope imports keep flowing. We abandoned fuel sovereignty because it was cheaper in the short term, and now we pay extra when global stress hits. We traded control for convenience, and that is a very bad trade. You don't have to be Warren Buffett to realise that is a horrific long-term business decision to make. And now our chickens might come home to roost. There's a very real possibility that in the next coming months we could actually run out of fuel. And if that happens, Australia stops. If the imports stop, the country stops. And that's not a very good business decision or strategy to have, not from a first world country. So how do imports dominate the system? As we just saw, Australia imports 80 to 90% of its refined petrol and diesel and jet fuel. Those imports come mainly from Singapore and South Korea, and some smaller contributions from elsewhere in Asia. Even the crude Australia produces domestically is often exported because it's light sweet crude that doesn't match what local refineries are configured to process. So it's refined elsewhere, then brought back into the country, which is insane when you think about it. We are producing a product that we don't have the capacity to refine, so we put it on a ship, send it overseas to be refined, to be put back onto a ship and sent back to point of origin. Doesn't sound very logical or efficient, especially when you think of the size of Australia. The entire country's supply chain runs on truck and train transport. Australia is fucking huge. All the cities are spread out. It's not like the US. You can't just drive an hour or two to the next city. The closest city to where I am is like an 8 to 9 hour drive on a good day. You would think that a country like that would want to have a rock solid fuel dependency strategy. You would think they would want to have fuel security locked down pretty tightly. But I know it's just far cheaper to import from Asia than it is to invest in either upgrading or making new refineries that can process oil that we drill for in this country. If we do produce and export so much sweet light crude oil, wouldn't you think there'd be at least one facility in the country that could refine it and use it? Because overall that would be cheaper in the long run, building a refinery or some type of processing center to refine and process the light sweet crude. You would think that would be cheaper in the long run than sticking it on a ship to be exported for refinery, only to have it be re-imported. So what exactly is light sweet crude? I don't know, so I looked it up. Light sweet crude oil, according to Google, is the most sought after type of petroleum, characterized by low density, quote, light, and low sulfur contents less than 0.5%, or, quote, sweet. It is easy to refine into high demand products like gasoline, kerosene, and jet fuel. Common benchmarks include West Texas Intermediary, WTI, and Brent. Gasoline production heavily utilized in simple refineries for high yields of gasoline, jet fuel, and diesel, the preferred feedstock for producing high quality distillates. Petrochemical industry used to create various consumer and industrial products. So it's got a lot of practical applications. It's used for fuel. So that makes the issue of refining it in Australia even dumber and completely non-logical. Why the fuck aren't we refining it here? If you can use it for fuel, wouldn't it make more sense to convert one of the existing or older refineries, doing that up so it can process the light sweet crude oil, rather than sending it offshore to be processed? I don't know, just a thought. Domestic refining became uncompetitive because it was cheaper to buy finished petrol from Asia than run small refineries here. Okay, interesting. This lowered costs in the good times but created enormous exposure when supply chains get disrupted, like we are seeing now. Fuel reserves, the numbers Australia doesn't want you to focus on. So the official stockpile figures as of early 2026 are: the government reported around 36 days of petrol reserves, 34 days of diesel, and 32 days of jet fuel. Still below the International Energy Agency's recommended 90-day level. And why does Australia have such low fuel stocks? If it's been recommended by the International Energy Agency to have at least a 90-day stock level if shit hits the fan, why the fuck does Australia only have 36 days? That seems pretty fucking stupid to me. The other question is, can we actually believe what the government is telling us, considering they are a bunch of pathological liars and have lied about pretty much everything? So analysts who stripped out the fuel that is physically on Australian soil and not in transit, i.e. ships and deliveries that are coming to Australia, put the actual usable reserve figures at 23 days of petrol, 22 days of diesel, and just 18 days of jet fuel, depending on how supply timing is counted. This means if imports actually stopped, the fuel we could physically pump might be closer to 3 weeks or less, which is absolutely fucking terrifying, and it's a vulnerability during a global crisis. Look, hopefully the government learns from what is happening right now and says, let's not let this happen again. The world is becoming more unstable. Let's lock down the fuel supply so we can be self-sufficient for a minimum of 2 years and not 32 days. Imported fuel is vulnerable, and here's the math that explains why. Asian refinery reliance. Major suppliers like Singapore, South Korea, Japan, Malaysia, and China produce the fuel Australia buys. Disruptions there directly affect our ability and prices because we have almost no refining buffer of our own. And this is where one refinery that could produce light sweet crude oil could come in very fucking handy. Much of the fuel must pass through strategic global routes, especially the Strait of Hormuz, where geopolitical conflict now snarls supply and pushes prices up before any physical shortage hits our tanks. Australia's fuel system runs on a lean, just-in-time model with minimal stock holding on hand, meaning delays in shipments quickly translate into panic pricing and real fuel shortages. Domestic production isn't enough, even when it does exist. Local production versus refining reality. Australia still produces crude, roughly 320,000 barrels per day, of mostly light sweet crude. But the crude isn't suited to the little refining we have left here. Those remaining refineries operate with government support because they can't survive commercial pressures without subsidies. The federal government continues a fuel security services payment to keep them viable. That's even more concerning, that the whole industry is just not even economically viable in this country anymore. This means Australia does produce oil, but it can't turn it into petrol at the scale needed without importing most of our fuel anyway. But surely there's a way to balance both, to have imports but not rely so heavily on them, and maybe have a more economical or cost-effective way to refine the light sweet crude that we have. Because 320,000 barrels a day is still quite a lot. There must be some type of balance point, especially now where if a supply chain is disrupted, surely the government has to step in and say, we're going to cover the cost of this. The taxpayer always ends up paying for it. We'll build a refinery to handle this emergency production, or just to scale up production so we have more than fucking 32 days of fuel. If they can spend $500 million on a failed referendum, they can put that fucking money into making a refinery, or converting one of the already closed ones to refine the light crude oil. The government wastes so much money on pointless shit, and you can't tell me they can't find a couple of $1 million lying around in a fucking drawer in Canberra somewhere to put into securing this country's fucking fuel supplies. I mean, just recently I read that they spent $318 million on a witch hunt trying to get evidence on Ben Robert Smith. They spent $17 million investigating each SAS soldier flying to Afghanistan on the taxpayer dime to try and find fucking locals, or pull someone's name out of a hat and try to get some testimony out of them for cash incentives. So if the government can waste $300 fucking million in that it can find $300 million and make a refinery to lock down our fuel supply, because this won't be the last war. It's definitely not going to be the last Middle Eastern war, and situations like this are going to continue in the future and get worse because the geopolitical situation in the world is deteriorating. So in other words, we exported crude, then imported refined fuel, and paid more for it. We had refineries, but we shut them down for quote-unquote efficiency and cost saving. And now we get gouged when the system breaks. We hold far fewer reserves than sensible standards, then tell people, quote, everything's fine and not to panic. I can't blame people for panicking and panic buying. If I had more money, I would have brought a bunch of jerry cans and filled them up with petrol. This is the real economic absurdity, a fuel security system built for efficiency and cost minimization, not resilience, which only matters when things go wrong. So remember this, Australia had the capacity for fuel itself. We chose convenience over resilience, cheap imports over sovereign capability. Now we're at the mercy of global markets, geopolitical choke points, and a handful of overseas refineries. And the moment the world hiccups, we pay twice. That's not just risk, that's strategic self-sabotage, which the Australian government is exceptional at. What happens if the Asian refineries, one, can't get the raw product, in this case the crude, to refine into fuel? Yeah, we do send them some, but they get most of it from other sources. 15 to 20% obviously comes from the Middle East. What happens if those refineries, catch fire, they blow up, or something happens to them? There's a massive natural disaster, an earthquake or a tsunami, and that Asian supply is disrupted. If that is how Australia relies on getting its fuel, I think we are all fucked. And we will be living like Mad Max sooner rather than later. We'll be having to drill for oil ourselves, just like in Furiosa, be the bullet farm and gas town. That's probably what Australia's future is going to look like. Can't wait. Section 4. How much fuel Australia actually burns every day. To understand why fuel prices are like they are, we need to understand scale. How much fuel does Australia actually burn? How many trucks, planes, cars, buses and machines are running every day in this country? Because once you see the numbers, you realise something. Modern civilization doesn't run on sunshine and rainbows, it runs on oil. No matter what any environmentalist tries to tell you, oil isn't going away anytime soon, and it's still king of the energy sector. Total fuel use in Australia. Australia consumes roughly 1.1 million barrels of oil per day, which equals about 175 million litres of petroleum fuels every single day, including petrol for cars, diesel for trucks and mining, jet fuel for planes, marine fuel, agriculture, machinery, construction equipment. Over a year, this equals roughly 63 billion litres of fuel. And that's just in Australia. Countries with bigger populations, you can times that by about 100. I can only imagine how much fuel is used in America per day, or Canada, somewhere with massive populations. The US and Canada, like Australia, rely heavily on truck, train and plane transport. They're all large countries, and it's the only economical way to get produce and supplies to all areas of the country. There's no cheaper way to do it in countries that size. And I imagine Russia is probably the same. Australia has roughly 20 million registered passenger vehicles, which is impressive because we're a country of only about 26.5 million people, or 27 million, something like that. So 20 million registered passenger vehicles is pretty impressive. Nearly everybody drives in this country. Passenger vehicles alone consume about 18,094 megalitres of fuel annually, about 18 billion litres. Daily fuel use by Australian drivers, 18 billion litres per year divided by 365, is 49 million litres of petrol a day. So everyday Australian drivers alone burn roughly 50 million litres of petrol per day. Average car fuel consumption. Typical passenger car consumption is about 11.1 litres per 100 kilometres. If the average driver travels 30 to 35 kilometres per day, that equals roughly 3 to 4 litres per car per day. Multiply that by millions of vehicles and the number explodes. Trucks, the backbone of freight and transport in Australia. Australia has roughly 173,000 articulated trucks, 41,000 rigid trucks, total freight trucks, 224,000 heavy vehicles. Average heavy truck consumption is between 30 to 55 litres per 100 kilometres. That depends on the load the trucks are carrying. Large road trains can use 55 to 60 litres per 100 kilometres. An example of a long-haul freight run, which is a typical interstate freight truck, which is very common in this country. Freight trucks run at all hours of the day, 7 days a week. And as I said, where I am to the next city is 9 hours. That's a hell of a long drive for a truck driver. And that's a relatively close distance. Some of these trucks they go all over the country to the top end, down to Western Australia, across to SA, Victoria, New South Wales, up to Queensland. They do millions of kilometres a year. An average long-haul freight run is 800 kilometres per day. Fuel use is 40 litres per 100 kilometres. Daily fuel use equates to 320 litres per truck per day. Now, the national truck fuel burn estimate, if even 150,000 trucks operate daily, that's 150,000 trucks times 320 litres of fuel, equaling 48 million litres of diesel per day. That means trucks alone burn almost as much fuel as all Australian cars combined. Freight vehicles consumed roughly 7,480 megalitres of fuel annually, which was almost entirely diesel. Now we come to public transport, buses in particular. This is specifically the diesel fleet of buses. Australia has about 100,000 buses across the public transport sector. This includes school and charter fleets. Average diesel bus consumption, roughly 27 to 30 litres per 100 kilometres. A typical city bus might travel between 2 to 300 kilometres per day, with a fuel consumption of 60 to 80 litres per day. National bus fuel estimate is 100,000 buses times 70 litres per day, equaling 7 million litres of fuel per day. So next up is aviation. How much jet fuel is consumed in Australia? Australia's aviation sector burns enormous amounts of fuel. Pre-pandemic jet fuel use was roughly 7 to 8 billion litres per year. Daily average 20 million litres per day. Examples of a typical aircraft fuel burn: a Boeing 737, 2,500 litres per hour. That's a fucking lot. On an average Sydney to Melbourne flight, 7,500 litres. Large international aircraft like a Boeing 777 can burn 10 to 12 tons of fuel per hour. Wow, that's incredible. Putting that in perspective, 10 to 12 tons of fuel per hour is like burning the equivalent weight of a T-Rex in fuel every hour. That is a hell of a lot. I thought air travel was a lot more efficient than that. That's 12,000 plus litres per hour. And as I mentioned before, the cities are spread out in Australia. Air travel is a very common way for people to go state to state because it just takes too long to drive in most cases. It's cheaper and safer to catch a plane than it is to drive. Because no one wants to drive 8 to 9 hours just to get down to Melbourne, or a day and a half, 2 days to get to Sydney, depending on where you are. Now we come down to Australia's mining equipment, which is a giant fuel consumer. Mining is one of the biggest diesel consumers in Australia. Large mining haul trucks use between 3,000 to 4,000 litres of diesel per day. Major iron ore mines may run 100 to 200 trucks simultaneously. 150 trucks times 3,500 litres of fuel is 525,000 litres of fuel per day at a single mine. That is a hell of a lot of fuel. Mining uses billions of litres of diesel annually right across the country. We've all seen those massive mining trucks. God knows only how much fuel they burn through in an hour. Just starting one of those things up probably costs about $10,000. If anyone's seen that show on 7 Mate, that one where those fucking crazy people go out to the desert to look for opals, I can't remember the name of it, Opal Kings or something like that. They'll go out there trying to strike it rich and find opal veins out in the middle of the fucking desert where it's always brutally hot. I remember one episode, this guy was in, was it Cooper Pedy or somewhere like that, and he had a small, well, basically a very tiny micro mining operation. He had brought an old digger, one of those ones with the extendable arm on it. I think he paid like 25 grand or something for it. There was a couple of issues with it, which he had to get fixed. But the point I'm trying to make is this guy's partner kept turning the digger on to dig out a couple of meters of dirt to look for opals. Then he would turn the machine off, and then he'd turn it back on to dig out a few more meters of soil, and then turn it off. And I remember the partner saying to him, every time you turn that on, that cost me $1,000 in diesel. So only turn it on when you actually need it. Or if you're going to turn it on, dig out a whole section, and then we can go through it and look for opals or minerals or whatever the fuck's in there. And that was the first time I really thought about how much it actually costs to run these machines. And he made a good point. He was saying like over an 8 to 10 hour period, if they turn that thing on once every hour, that's $8,000 to $10,000 a day just in diesel costs. And this guy's running on a shoestring budget. He's all privately financed. He's not a massive mine. He hasn't got Gina Reinhardt backing him or anything like that. So you can only imagine the costs of some of these massive mines. And there's mines in Australia that are like the size of small European countries. I can only imagine just how much the fuel bill costs per day. Next up is agriculture. Fuel for food. So farming operations rely very heavily on diesel. Large tractors can use 15 to 40 litres per hour. A combine harvester, 15 to 80 litres per hour. Typical grain farm seasonal diesel use is between 30,000 and 60,000 litres per year during harvest. Machinery can burn up to 500 plus litres per day. Now, across the thousands of farms, agriculture consumes hundreds of millions of litres annually, and that's just to produce the food that we need to live. So next up is probably my favourite, and that is rail freight. Like I mentioned before, like Australia and Canada, rail transport is a massive industry, and it's the only way to really economically and efficiently transport large amounts of freight across a country is because the US, Australia or Canada. So diesel locomotives power much of Australia's freight rail network. A typical locomotive fuel tank is about 5,000 litres, and they consume about 3 to 4 litres per kilometre, which is actually pretty good considering the size and weight of the vehicle. That's more efficient than most cars on the road, 3 to 4 litres. If we compare how much a train uses with the average car fuel consumption. The typical passenger car consumes about 11.1 litres of fuel per 100 kilometres, which equates to roughly 3 to 4 litres per car per day. When you consider that with a diesel locomotive, they use 3 to 4 litres per kilometre, which in comparison is actually not that bad when you consider how big some of those freight trains are. The biggest freight train ever recorded came out of a mine in Western Australia. It was an iron ore mine. The train itself was like 3 kilometres long, and it weighed well over 100,000 tonnes, which was the equivalent to nearly 2 Titanics. So that's not too bad when you consider the weight and size of these vehicles and how much they actually pull. So a long freight journey across Australia may burn thousands of litres of fuel per trip, which given the size of the country is not that hard to believe. Construction machinery also consumes large quantities of diesel. An excavator, which is what I meant to say before, I couldn't think of the name of it, uses 15 to 25 litres of fuel per hour. A bulldozer, 30 to 50 per hour. Large infrastructure projects can burn thousands of litres of fuel per day on site. So putting this all together, approximate daily fuel use across all sectors. Cars use about 50 million litres a day, trucks 40 to 50 million, planes about 20 million, buses 7 million, mining 20 plus million, agriculture, rail and construction 20 to 30 million, giving us a total of 160 to 180 million litres of fuel used every day, which aligns with the 1.1 million barrels a day national consumption estimate. That's a hell of a lot of fuel. Everything in this country depends on fuel. That's why when oil prices move, it hits the entire economy like an earthquake. Fuel isn't just something you put in your car, it's the energy system underneath modern civilization. You change the price of oil and you change the price of pretty much everything. Rail transportation, out of all the other transportation methods we've seen, is the sector that interests me the most. I love trains, as you probably know if you listen to the show for any length of time. I do get really excited when the boom gates go down and a goods train goes past. I still try to count all the locomotives and carriages. I do get a kick out of that. On the weekend I went for a walk and there was 2 goods trains, so I considered myself lucky I got to see them both on the walk. No matter how loud they can be and how much they do delay your trip, I do love it when the boom gates go down and a freight train goes past. I've loved trains since I was a kid. I've always thought about being a train driver and how large the rail network must be in a country the size of Australia. So I had to do some research to answer this question. What is the size of the Australian rail network? Australia has one of the largest rail freight systems in the world. It has 33,000 kilometres of rail track across the entire country, with only 10% of it being electrified. The remaining 90% is powered by diesel locomotives. And I'm pretty sure it's because the electrified trains aren't strong enough or powerful enough to carry the loads that they do in Australia. I know in other countries, especially in Europe, they have electrified passenger and freight trains. I don't think that's logical or logistical in a country the size of Australia, because there is a train track that goes from Perth all the way to Sydney. It cuts through Adelaide and right through the desert in between Western Australia and South Australia. It's thousands of kilometres of not a lot really. I'm not going to say nothing because obviously something is there. It's hot, it's brutal, and you don't want to get stuck. It would be probably impossible to build a self-sufficient electric line out there, especially if a blackout happened. I'd imagine the heat would probably affect the electricity, or you could blow up a transformer or something like that, and it could take days or weeks to get a crew to the site to fix it, and then there's nothing out there. There's no place for them to stay. You'd probably have to fly them out in a helicopter or something like that. It would be blistering hot, and who the fuck wants to work on a transformer in the middle of the desert, unless it's Optimus Prime. There's another train line that goes from South Australia all the way up through the centre of the country, right through to Darwin. The GAN travels across that line, which is the famous passenger train. The Indian Pacific goes from SA to Western Australia, to Perth, I'm pretty sure. The overlander goes from SA, I think, to is it Sydney or is it Melbourne? I can't remember. There's other equivalent train services all the way around the country. And that doesn't even include the freight trains. There's Western Pacific or Western Union, which is the blue and the yellow train, my favourite. There's the white and red company. I can't remember what one that is. Green and yellow, which is National Railways. I'm showing how much of a train nerd I am. And there's a few other companies that operate pretty much all the freight trains in the country. And I live in suburbia, and the freight trains cut through the suburban rail lines, past the city and go on to the next state. There's a freight line next to the two commuter lines. There used to be more, but obviously they got rid of them because they thought it wasn't viable. But I can tell you there's more freight trains than ever. There's usually a couple a week. I see at least 1 to 2 a week. A busy week I might see 5. I don't always see them, but I do hear them. I don't live that too far away from a train line. It does show you how much freight does come through the country. And the train lines are busier than ever. I don't remember them being this frequently used before. So it's an industry that's probably never going to go out of business in a country this size. And it's probably the same in the US and Canada. Got a bit off topic there, but going back to what I was originally saying, yeah, I don't think it's logistically sensible to have a fully electrified line, especially a freight line. It's too dangerous to build out in the middle of nowhere. It's not powerful enough. So that leaves diesel-powered locomotives to do most of the heavy lifting. And if you know anything about diesel locomotives, that is a little deceptive because diesel locomotives are technically hybrid. They have been for a long time. The first hybrid trains started with mining trains and like utility trains right back in the early 1900s, I'm pretty sure. They used to have hybrid fuel and electric. Might have not been the 1900s, it might have been later than that, like the 1930s. They had like battery-powered trains, I'm pretty sure. There's one I saw in the museum last year. But pretty much all diesel locomotives have batteries on them. Next time you see a freight train, count how many locomotives it has. If it has more than 2, I'm pretty sure the first 2 are on and powered up, and the third and fourth are basically spares if anything happens to the first 2 doing the work. But the power from the trains that are operational, powers up the batteries in the trains that aren't on, I'm pretty sure. When I was at the National Rail Museum last year, I looked inside an older diesel, had a massive diesel engine in it. It was fucking huge. It was like 2 of my cars long, but you can also see the battery packs as well. So I know with the more modern engines, they have these massive diesel engines and they basically charge a wall of batteries. And as I just said, they link up and connect to the trains that aren't powering and pushing the train forward, but they are charging the batteries. That helps run utility systems like lights and things like that. So trains are pretty efficient, and pretty much most of them are all hybrids. So you can't really say that they're purely just a diesel locomotive. So how big is the locomotive fleet in Australia? Australia operates roughly 2,500 to 3,000 diesel locomotives across freight and passenger networks. I actually thought it would be more than that. I thought it would be in the thousands, like 8 to 10,000, maybe more. Major freight operators include Ausian, that's the one I couldn't remember, Ausian, I think it's pronounced Ausian. Pacific National, which is the blue and yellow one, I'm pretty sure. SET Logistics, Freightliner Australia, which might be the white and red one. These companies move iron ore, coal, grain, containers, agricultural products, and consumer goods. Diesel locomotive fuel capacity. Freight locomotives carry huge fuel tanks. A typical tank size in a standard freight locomotive is 4,000 to 6,000 litres. A heavy haul locomotive is around 7,000 to 10,000 litres. That is a lot. I'd hate to have to pay for that bill. An example, an EMD GT46C has a fuel capacity of 9,200 litres. The GE Evolution series has a fuel capacity of 7,500 litres. These locomotives are designed to operate long distances between refueling stops, especially in remote areas like the outback. And that's the other problem. is there are no petrol stations out in the fucking outback. If you're in a train, you have to have enough fuel in order to get the job done and travel these massive long distances, which is also probably why they have the extra trains. If one runs out of fuel, which I don't think they do, because they obviously have enough and can carry more if they need it. You have other trains that are a backup, and like I said before, if anything happens, if any of them break down or have an electrical problem, you have an extra backup train, because there is no help out in the outback, especially crossing places like Nullarbor. You break down out there, you're basically as good as dead. So what is the fuel consumption per locomotive? Fuel consumption varies, and it's based on the obvious factors such as load weight, terrain, train length, and the speed the train is travelling. If you're going uphill, you're going to probably burn more fuel because you're going to push the engine harder, obviously. Typical diesel freight locomotive consumption is between 3 to 4 litres per kilometre. I still find that really fascinating that they only use 3 to 4 litres per kilometre. I mean, a kilometre isn't really that long, but if you're hauling like 100 containers, that's a lot of fucking weight. So it is pretty economical, I guess. And when you're out in the outback, you can go a bit faster. A typical freight train route between Sydney and Perth is roughly a distance of 4,300 kilometres. So estimated fuel consumption for a journey this long would be 3.5 litres per kilometre times by 4,300 kilometres, equaling 15,000 litres of diesel used. But bearing in mind that is for a single locomotive. Long freight trains often use 2, 3, sometimes 4 and even more locomotives. So a full train might burn 30 to 45,000 litres of diesel for one cross-country journey. Interesting. A good example of this is a coal train, and I'm not talking about the jazz musician. Coal transport is one of the largest rail fuel consumers. Australia exports huge volumes of coal. A typical coal train has between 100 to 120 wagons, which is a lot, and carries 8 to 10,000 tonnes. These trains usually run with multiple locomotives. The daily operational fuel burn for the Hunter Valley coal train is between 8 to 12,000 litres per day. If you multiply that across dozens of trains operating continuously, these numbers start to add up very quickly. I mentioned the Western Australian iron ore trains before, so let's have a look at how much fuel these trains use. So in Western Australia, some of the largest trains on Earth operate. Iron ore trains can be 2 to 3 kilometres long, typically hauling 30,000 tonnes. That's nearly 3 times a standard coal train. These trains typically use 4 locomotives, which is impressive because the coal trains also use 2 to 3 locomotives, and this has an extra locomotive, and it's usually pulling 30,000 tonnes. However, the estimated fuel consumption for these iron ore trains is about 10 to 15,000 litres per trip, which is roughly the same as some of the interstate freight trains. Mining rail operations run 24 hours a day, so a single rail corridor can burn hundreds of thousands of litres per day. Now let's have a look at passenger rail fuel use. While many city trains are electric, regional and long-distance passenger trains are often run on diesel. For example, the Indian Pacific, Sydney to Perth, is a 4,300 kilometre journey. So the Indian Pacific goes from Sydney to Perth, not SA to Perth. It might stop through SA, I don't know. Estimated fuel consumption, 10 to 15,000 litres per trip, roughly the same as the iron ore trains from Western Australia. Other diesel passenger trains operate in rural New South Wales, regional parts of Queensland, parts of WA and the Northern Territory. Total rail diesel consumption, rail accounts for roughly 4 to 5% of Australia's diesel consumption. Since Australia burns roughly 32 billion litres of diesel annually, that means rail uses 1.3 to 1.6 billion litres of diesel per year, with a daily average of 3.5 to 4.5 million litres per day. So far in the media, I haven't heard a lot about fuel costs and the rail industry, but I guess it feels the effect like every other industry that uses diesel. Rail is actually more fuel efficient than trucks. That one's pretty obvious. One freight train can replace 100 to 150 trucks on the road, but rail still depends heavily on diesel, meaning when diesel prices spike, freight rail costs rise, coal and mineral transport costs rise, agricultural exports become more expensive, container freight prices increase, and those costs have a knock-on effect throughout the economy, like everything else we've seen so far. However, you can make the argument that maybe we should be saving the diesel for rail transport because it is more efficient. So if prices are going to go up, isn't it better to prioritize the industries that need it more than the others? I guess if you're a trucker, you probably don't want to hear that, but at the end of the day, trains are more efficient. Rail might be the most efficient way to move freight across a continent, but even the most efficient diesel locomotive still burns thousands of litres of fuel every day. Multiply that across thousands of trains moving iron ore, coal, grain and containers across Australia, and suddenly you see just how deeply oil is embedded in the economy. So as I mentioned before, Australia uses 170 million litres of fuel every single day, 7 days a week. But what does 170 million litres of fuel actually look like? That number is so big it becomes pretty meaningless unless we can relate it to something real and something we can visualise. An Olympic swimming pool holds about 2.5 million litres of water. So if you filled pools with Australia's daily fuel consumption, 170 million, divided by 250 million, that equals 68 Olympic swimming pools of fuel every single day, which is quite a lot. And I didn't actually know there was that much water in an Olympic swimming pool, so it shows what I know. So let's have a look at the fuel tanker trucks and trains that carry the fuel that other trucks, trains and cars use every single day. So a standard road fuel tanker truck carries roughly 36,000 litres of fuel. So if trucks were to move the 170 million litres of fuel that Australia uses every day, you would need 4,700 tanker trucks to do so. That means if Australia's daily fuel consumption arrived only by road tankers, you would see nearly 5,000 fuel trucks arriving every single day. Trains, on the other hand, a single rail tanker wagon carries about 70,000 litres of fuel. A full fuel train might have 40 to 50 wagons, meaning 3 million litres per train, which is obviously more efficient than a truck. But to move that 170 million litres of fuel, you would need 55 fully loaded fuel trains every single day. I've been talking about how efficient trains are for carrying freight and fuel, but they can't hold a candle to super tanker ships. Ships carry even more cargo and freight, obviously, than a train does. A large petroleum tanker can carry 1 to 2 billion litres of fuel. So one fully loaded tanker could technically supply about 6 to 12 days of Australia's fuel demand, which is why disruptions to global shipping lanes are so important. And if we think about 6 to 12 days, so just say 1 billion litres of fuel is 6 days, 2 billion is 12 days. So one tanker ship literally has the fate of an entire country in its cargo hold, more or less. And it's kind of scary. If we only have 32 days of fuel on hand, or 50 to 60 days, whatever it is, which is still under the recommended amount, that doesn't say a lot about the national fuel reserve and the country's fuel stockpile. Because if one of those ship tankers doesn't come, if we only have 6 days or 12 days of fuel, and we miss one, that means in less than 2 weeks you could possibly run out of fuel. So this brings up the question, the strategic reality of Australia's fuel reserves. And this is the part most people never really think about. Australia consumes around 170 million litres of fuel every single day, yet the country imports the vast majority of its refined fuel, which means the ships must keep arriving, the ports must keep operating, the global supply chain must keep functioning. Because if it stops, as we all know, the fuel won't last very long. And that's a big if. So the ships have to arrive, the ports need to stay open. But more importantly, if there's a hiccup in the global supply chain like we have seen in the last couple of weeks, we could be completely fucked. And this raises a very uncomfortable question. If those ships stopped arriving tomorrow, how long could Australia realistically keep running? And the answer to that question is where things start to get very uncomfortable. Section 5, fuel reserves. How long could Australia actually last? So we know how much fuel Australia uses every single day across cars, trucks, aviation, rail, mining, shipping and agriculture. But the real question isn't how much we use. The real question is how much do we actually have stored inside the country if the imports stop? Australia's strategic fuel reserve situation. Australia does not maintain large domestic fuel reserves compared with most developed nations. Historically, Australia only keeps around 20 to 30 days of fuel stocks, which includes petrol, diesel, and jet fuel, which fucking should alarm every person living in this country. Like I said, 6 to 12 days of fuel from one tanker ship. If one tanker ship is late or doesn't arrive or is sunk or decides to keep the fuel for the country that it comes from, we're fucked. If 2 tanker ships don't arrive, there's nothing to top up Australia's fuel stocks. We'd burn through those 20 to 30 days pretty fucking quickly. And all it would need would be one ship to be a week late. If the ship is 2 weeks late, we are really starting to panic because that 20 days is not going to go very far. There's a big difference between the 20 to 30 days too. That's a 10-day difference between complete fucking chaos and anarchy and civil unrest and order. It also means food would stop coming. The farmers can't grow the food, the trucks can't pick it up, and the trains can't get it around the country. Then we are pretty much living like it's Mad Max. So maybe George Miller was onto something, and that should alarm every person living in Australia. Maybe this government needs to start thinking right now, how can we up the fuel stocks to 100, 200 days just to be safe? And as we've seen, fuel is stored at refineries, ones that were converted into terminals, commercial storage terminals, as well as fuel that's already in distribution networks. And this is not part of a dedicated government strategic reserve like other countries maintain. This is mostly commercial inventory, which is even more frightening because if these commercial entities go under, they can't afford to get fuel in or out of the storage facilities or refineries. We plunge into chaos very quickly. So why the fuck doesn't the government have a dedicated government-run strategic reserve of fuel? There's enough space out in the fucking desert. They can build a gigantic storage facility. I just don't get it. The IEA requirement. Australia is a member of the International Energy Agency, the IEA. IEA member countries are required to maintain 90 days of net fuel imports in reserve. Australia has failed to meet this requirement for most of the last decade. Why? We're a first world nation, we've got plenty of fucking money, plenty of space. Why are we failing to meet this 90-day recommendation? Why are we one of the only fucking first world developed countries on planet Earth to fail this requirement? In fact, for years, Australia has ranked last among all IEA countries for fuel security compliance. And we are feeling those effects right now. I think Australia is going to get a very rude awakening very soon if they don't do something about the fuel crisis right fucking now. The strange solution: storing fuel in the United States. Instead of building massive domestic storage facilities like any normal logical person would, Australia struck a deal with the United States Strategic Petroleum Reserve. The Australian government began purchasing and storing crude oil in American underground reserves. These reserves are massive salt caverns located in Texas and Louisiana. But there is an obvious problem. That is oil stored 13,000 kilometres away in a different country. Now, apparently, former Prime Minister Scott Morrison, during COVID when the oil price crashed, he brought 2 million barrels of oil at $39 a barrel and did a deal with the United States to have it stored in Texas. And apparently when the Labor Albanese government came to power a few years ago, they sold off most of those reserves, about 70 to 80% of them, because they claimed they didn't need them and they were looking for alternative green solutions to energy, which has come back to bite us in the fucking balls right now. However, I still think there would have been a problem with trying to transport the oil from Texas or Louisiana all the way down to Australia when there is this other overarching oil crisis affecting the entire planet. And the problem with that oil is it was crude oil, it wasn't refined fuel, which means we would have had to get it to Australia to send it to a refinery in Asia somewhere to have them refine it and then send it back as usable fuel. So in an emergency, number 1, the crude would need to be released. 2, it needs to be shipped across the Pacific. 3, refined somewhere else. And 4, it needs to be transported back to Australia. And that is a process that can take weeks or months. which means it does not solve an immediate fuel disruption, and that whole process would take more than the 20 to 30 days of strategic fuel reserves that Australia has. I think it would probably take months to get it from a facility, and this is if everything works properly and there's no interruptions, to get it from Texas to ship it to a refinery in Southeast Asia or somewhere. Just say Japan's probably closest, Japan or China. How long does it take to refine? I know, days, weeks, who the fuck knows. Load it up and then send it back here. That would take months, and by that time the country could have actually run out of fuel. So how do other countries handle fuel security? To understand how unusual Australia's situation is, it helps to compare countries like the United States. The SPR, Strategic Petroleum Reserve in the United States, is the largest emergency oil stockpile on Earth. It has a capacity of 714 million barrels, that equals roughly 113 billion litres of oil. It's stored underground in salt caverns along the Gulf Coast. The US can release millions of barrels per day during supply shocks. Maybe we should be taking a leaf out of the United States book. China. China has been aggressively building strategic petroleum reserves since the early 2000s. It has an estimated storage capacity of 500 million barrels. China continues expanding these reserves through massive storage tank farms along its coastline. Japan maintains one of the most robust fuel security systems in the world. Japan stores government strategic reserves as well as commercial fuel stocks. Interesting. Giving the country 160 to 200 days of supply. This includes both crude oil and refined products. Japan takes fuel security seriously because it imports nearly all of its oil. Now, maybe that's the example we need to follow more so than the US one. If Japan imports nearly all of its fuel, maybe we need to do the same thing. If we're not going to open refineries because it's not cost effective, we need to be copying this method. 160 to 200 days should be a minimum. And given the size of Australia, I'd probably say more like 400 days is probably the minimum, 400 to 500 days, because we probably use more diesel than Japan, even though there is more people and there's more cars. I think it's the freight in Australia that is the real killer and a massive consumer of diesel. So we need to be copying the Japanese model. I don't know why, when Australia doesn't take this seriously, when the distances are so long and road and air transport and rail transport are really the only ways you can efficiently get around. We don't have bullet trains or high-speed rail networks. We can't get on a bullet train and go to Sydney to Melbourne in 10 minutes. The government's been talking about it for 50 years, but nothing ever comes of it. So until we can get a more efficient transport system, oil is king in this country. South Korea also maintains large strategic petroleum reserves, with a total storage capacity of 200 million barrels, enough to cover 90 to 100 days of imports. South Korea has invested heavily in massive storage tank facilities near major ports. Australia, by comparison, when you stack Australia against these countries, the contrast is stark. Australia consumes 170 million litres per day, imports 80 to 90% of refined fuel, historically stored between 20 to 30 days domestically. Even after recent improvements, Australia is still playing catch-up. Why Australia didn't build strategic reserves? That's a really good question. For decades, the dominant economic philosophy was simple. Global markets will always supply fuel until they don't. Oil was treated like any other commodity. If Australia needed fuel, the thinking went, the market would simply just deliver it. Once again, until it doesn't. As we've seen before, stable shipping lanes, stable geopolitics, and functioning global trade. And history shows those conditions don't always hold. Nothing in the world at the moment is fucking stable. Shipping lanes definitely aren't with the Strait of Hormuz. The geopolitical situation is completely fucked. And global trade is just up in the air, mainly thanks to Trump's tariffs. And he's also the guy that's fucked up the shipping lanes and has a large part to play in the current state of geopolitics. Him and Benjamin Netanyahu did start the war with Iran. What are some modern risks to the oil supply? Fuel supply chains can be disrupted by war, sanctions, shipping choke points, refinery outages, economic shocks. Recent global events have shown how fragile energy supply chains can be. I think that one is glaringly obvious at this point. The COVID-19 pandemic disrupted global logistics. The Russian invasion of Ukraine reshaped global energy markets. And major shipping choke points like the Strait of Hormuz or the Strait of Malacca remain critical vulnerabilities. A serious disruption to those routes could rapidly affect the fuel supply. Australia burns around 170 million litres of fuel every single day. The entire economy runs on it. But the uncomfortable truth is that most of that fuel arrives on ships. And if those ships stop coming, the clock starts ticking very quickly. Now we come down to probably the most critical and alarming part of the fuel crisis. Section 6, Fuel, Farming and Australia's Food Supply. When people hear about fuel shortages, they usually think about cars, trucks and maybe planes. But one of the biggest fuel consumers, as we've seen, most people never think about is agriculture. Modern farming is essentially industrial energy use spread across huge areas of land, and almost every stage of food production relies on diesel. And that is a very big concern and a very big issue when you consider the size of the Australian agricultural sector. Australia's agricultural sector is massive. According to the Australian Bureau of Agriculture and Resource Economics and Sciences, the ABRES, 85,000 farms operate across the country. Farms cover roughly 427 million hectares of land. Agricultural exports exceed 80 billion per year. And that's obviously a major source of income from Australia. Major sectors include wheat, barley, beef, sheep, dairy, sugar, cotton, and horticulture. Almost all of these rely heavily on diesel-powered machinery. So what is the fuel consumption of said farm machinery? A modern farm runs on a fleet of heavy diesel equipment. Common machinery includes tractors. Modern agricultural tractors burn 15 to 40 litres of diesel per hour. Large broadacre tractors can burn 60 plus litres an hour depending on the workload. Combine harvesters used during harvest consume roughly 50 to 70 litres of fuel per hour. Large harvest operations run these machines approximately 12 to 16 hours a day during peak season. Other pieces of farm equipment that most of us don't think of, such as irrigation pumps. Many irrigation systems use diesel pumps, which consume about 10 to 30 litres per hour. Large irrigation operations can pump continuously for weeks. If you're seeing the size of some of the farms in Australia, they are absolutely huge. Some of them you could literally fit a European country inside of and not find it again. I saw another show on 7 Mate where this farmer has moved out to the middle of nowhere. It's out in the centre of Australia somewhere. He's got this giant farm. Just the growing section of it was enormous. He had these 4 massive, I think, wheat fields and like a watermelon field or something like that. And these irrigation systems were enormous. They were like hundreds of feet long. The fields themselves were like several football fields, and he had 4 of them all next to each other. Crop sprayers. Large self-propelled crop sprayers used between 20 to 40 litres per hour and are used repeatedly throughout growing seasons. Diesel use in grain production. Grain farming is one of Australia's largest agricultural industries. The Grain Research and Development Corporation estimates that fuel is one of the largest operating costs for grain producers. It's used for soil preparation, planting, spraying, harvesting and transporting. 60 to 100 litres of diesel per hectare may be used over a full growing season. For large grain farms covering thousands of hectares, that means hundreds of thousands of litres of fuel per day. And these are the industries where diesel isn't reaching because they can't get it to regional fuel stations, and that should be very alarming. What about the livestock industry? Another vital food producer. The livestock sector also depends heavily on diesel, such as feed transport, water pumping, mustering vehicles, refrigeration, meat transport. Australia produces roughly 25 million cattle and about 70 million sheep. Feeding, managing and transporting these animals involves constant vehicle movement and machinery use. And there's a cattle station up in Queensland, Cully Station or something like that. It's bigger than Belgium, apparently. It is fucking enormous. It's the biggest cattle station on Earth. The cattle station is so large they need a fleet of like these Mad Max vehicles as well as helicopters in order to find and round up the cows because they wander off into the bush. They need helicopters to round them up, to push them towards the vehicles, to get them towards the station in order to put them on transport trucks in order to move them, which is insane when you think about it. The scale of these farms is so big they need a fucking helicopter. Some of them even have planes they fly over to spot where the herds have gone. And now we come down to another critical part of agriculture, and that is fertiliser production and fuel. In recent weeks, there's been lots of mention in the media about Australia's fertiliser shortage and just like oil, a lot of fertiliser production comes out of the Middle East, and those supply chains have been disrupted because the ships carrying the fertiliser can't make it through the Strait of Hormuz, which has had this massive knock-on effect with fertiliser production. And farmers are saying they don't have enough fertiliser to put in the winter crops, which could affect yields in a couple of months' time at harvest, which is just another concerning aspect of modern day life here in Australia. So thanks, Trump. So another hidden fuel dependency is fertiliser. Nitrogen fertiliser production relies heavily on natural gas through the Haber-Bosch process. That process converts nitrogen from the air into ammonia used for fertiliser. Without it, global crop yields would fall dramatically. So even before diesel reaches the farm, fossil fuels are already embedded in fertiliser production. And the next stage in the process is food transport. Growing food is only the first step. Once it's been harvested, food must be transported across huge distances. Australia's food distribution network relies heavily on diesel trucking, such as grain transported to silos, livestock transported to feedlots, produce shipped to processing plants, refrigerated trucks delivering food to supermarkets. Food distribution alone accounts for millions of litres of diesel use per day. So the scale of agricultural fuel use in Australia is enormous. Australia's agricultural sector consumes roughly 3 to 4 billion litres of diesel per year, 8 to 11 million litres in total per day, and that's just to keep the farms operating. Modern agriculture isn't just farming, it is its own energy system in a way. Without fuel, crops can't be planted, crops can't be harvested, livestock can't be transported, and food can't reach supermarkets. Which means a fuel shortage doesn't just affect transport, it affects the food supply itself, which affects the consumer paying higher prices at the checkout or not being able to get food in the first place. I went shopping this morning and my local Aldi was pretty bare. There wasn't a lot of meat on the shelves. I don't know if that's just because I've had delays in shipments because of public holidays. We had the Easter public holiday over the weekend, so maybe they're catching up from that. Or is it a question that the trucks aren't going because they don't have the fuel to get there? Or is it an even bigger question of the fuel can't get from the producers to the distribution centres to be picked up by the trucks to be taken to the supermarket? So it really makes you wonder. In the modern world, food just isn't grown in soil alone, it's grown with diesel. So let's have a more detailed look into food transport and supply chains. So you've grown the crops, you've harvested the cattle, you've pumped the water and sprayed the fertiliser, but here's the inconvenient truth. It doesn't get to your plate automatically. Australia's food system is massive and highly dependent on fuel. Over 500,000 trucks operate in the freight and logistics sector. Roughly 90% of domestic freight by weight moves by road. Food and groceries make up 25 to 30% of total freight volume. Rail carries bulk commodities like grain and coal, but only 10% of perishable food. Interesting. Trucks, trains, and delivery vehicles. Road trucks, large refrigerated trucks consume 60 to 100 litres of diesel per 100 kilometres. An average truck travels 200 to 300 k's per day for food deliveries. Daily diesel per truck is around 120 to 360 litres. 125,000 trucks moving food daily, 15 to 30 million litres of diesel per day, just for food transport alone. Trains, rail freight, one locomotive, 4,500 litres of diesel a day, pulling 40 to 50 wagons, 3 million litres per full train load. Food-focused freight, 15 to 20 trains per day, 70,000 to 100,000 litres a day, much less than road, but essential for bulk commodities like grain. Now we have small delivery vans, the type you see around suburban areas, delivering milk to cafes, bread to bakeries and things like that. Urban food deliveries to supermarkets, grocery chains and home delivery. Vans average 10 to 15 litres per day, thousands of vans across cities add hundreds of thousands of litres per day. Supermarket supply chain vulnerability. Australia's supermarket and grocery sector operates on a just-in-time supply model, which doesn't sound like the best in the long term. Coles and Woolworths, 1 to 2 weeks of stock at warehouses. Whoa. That's disturbing when you think of 1 to 2 weeks. If there's a supply hiccup, and like I mentioned before, if a ship is a week late for its delivery, that means we're 1 week closer to complete chaos and anarchy. If the two big supermarket chains in this country, Coles and Woolworths, who ironically are both owned by the same entity, only have 1 to 2 weeks of stock at warehouses, that's fucked. We could potentially have a fuel and food shortage in a first world country. I just don't understand why we are so far behind the times. It's almost like the government fucking hates its own people. That's incredible and frightening to think about. 1 to 2 weeks of stock at a warehouse. And if the food going to the warehouse is delayed by a couple of days or a week because it can't get fuel or it can't get the food, we're in big trouble. If the farmers can't produce the food, or if their yields are down by half or 70% or something like that because they can't get the fertiliser to grow crops, to grow grains, to turn into cereals or longer life products, we could be fucked. We might be forced to import food from other parts of the world. Fresh produce 3 to 5 days in stores, milk 1 to 3 days before expiry. Meat 2 to 3 days in cold chain storage. This means any disruption to trucking or fuel immediately hits store shelves, which is frightening. The numbers that shock. The average Australian household consumes 3 to 5 kilos of fresh produce per day, requiring 100 to 150 litres of diesel in aggregate for farming, processing and delivery. Interesting, I never actually thought of the diesel cost after the food has already been delivered to the supermarket. Rough estimate, feeding 25 million Australians requires 25 million litres of diesel a day in food production plus transport combined. I guess each person in this country requires 1 million litres of diesel per person to get the food they consume. Food supply is extremely centralised. Just a handful of distribution hubs supply millions of people. A one-day disruption can leave urban areas empty within 48 hours. Fucking hell. That is horrifying. It's also disturbing to see how much diesel each person in Australia uses just to get the food to their table. Grain and bulk produce mostly arrives by rail, which is slower, but has a higher capacity. Perishables are transported by road, faster, smaller volume. Fuel disruption, perishable foods like milk, fruits, vegetables are first affected, even if bulk grains are still moving. If Australia does have a food shortage at some point over the next year or in the future, it's obviously going to hit the perishables like fruit and vegetables and things like that first. I think Australia will be one of the first world countries to have vitamin deficiencies because they can't get fresh fruits and vegetables anymore, which is fucked for a first world country that has probably more mineral wealth than most of the world combined. It's amazing. We can afford to buy anything with the minerals we export, but we export them for pennies on the dollar, and none of that money comes back into Australia, or some money does come back into Australia, but it's not being used in a efficient way. Cold chain dependency. Perishable food relies on continuous refrigeration. Refrigerated trucks and warehouse cold storage consume millions of kilowatts of electricity a day. Diesel powers backup generators when grid power fails, which has happened more and more in recent years because, let's face it, Australia's electricity grid is fucked. We have this illusion that we're going to go to net zero by 2030. I think most of the world has pretty much gotten over that, but Australia is committed to having all these renewables. The only problem is they're not producing enough energy for the consumption needed, and we won't go nuclear because that might pollute the planet. It is actually a renewable energy, but politicians won't even have conversations about it because they're so ideologically captured by the green energy barons. Without fuel, cold storage fails, produce spoils, which equals an economic and food waste disaster. And that should scare the fuck out of everybody here. Australia eats fuel for breakfast, literally. every carrot, every litre of milk, every loaf of bread depends on diesel-powered farms, diesel-powered trucks, and diesel-powered cold storage. So next time you see some environmentalist vegan feeling high and mighty about themselves at their local cafe, insisting on soy milk because normal milk is cruel, just remind them that they are as guilty as everybody else for destroying the planet, because that oat milk probably costs more in diesel to bring to the shop and to produce than the normal milk would have. Take out the fuel and within 48 hours, supermarket shelves start to empty. Within a week, the entire country starts to feel it. So this made me wonder, how much food do cities actually have? Most people assume that cities have massive warehouses full of food sitting somewhere in reserve, but that's not how the modern food system works. Modern food systems are designed for efficiency, not resilience, which is like every industry we've seen so far. They're not designed to be resilient. They're designed for efficiency and to be cost effective, which is short-term gain, but ignores long-term planning. Instead of storing huge amounts of food, supermarkets operate on what's known as just-in-time logistics. That means food is continuously delivered, often daily, which is also a massive waste of fuel when you think about it. The just-in-time food system. Large supermarket chains like Woolworths Group and Coles Group operate enormous logistics networks designed to keep products moving rather than sitting in storage. A typical supply chain looks like this: farm, processing plant, distribution center, supermarket, consumer. Most food moves through this system in a matter of days, not months. How much food is actually stored? Studies of modern supermarket supply chains suggest supermarkets typically carry 3 to 5 days of inventory on shelves. Distribution centers may hold 1 to 2 weeks of stock. Typical shelf timelines: milk lasts about 1 to 3 days in stores, fresh produce 2 to 5 days, fresh meat 2 to 3, bread 1 to 2. Which means the food system relies on constant restocking. So why don't cities store more food? Why don't they, freeze meat or something like that? Why isn't the system more effective and efficient? Large food reserves used to be more common decades ago, but modern logistics changed the equation. Holding large inventories is expensive because it requires warehouses, refrigeration, labour, insurance, and capital tied up in stock. So modern retailers minimize storage and rely on continuous deliveries instead. And yet, companies like Woolworths pretend they're offsetting the CO2 emissions by using less diesel and plastics in their packaging. In other words, they're a bunch of virtue signalling cunts that are perpetuating the problem and not doing anything to try and change it. Because that means there's more diesel being used to constantly deliver food to all these supermarkets, rather than invest in maybe a new way of storing food, maybe a smarter way. They're just going to continuously outsource deliveries because it's cheaper in the short term. When you really think about it, Western business is really fucked. This system is extremely efficient, but it also means disruptions move quickly through the system. Large cities consume enormous amounts of food every day. Take Sydney as an example. With a population of about 5 million people, daily food demand roughly includes thousands of tons of fresh produce, millions of litres of milk, hundreds of tons of meat and bread. None of that is stored for long. It's constantly moving. It makes me wonder how much is wasted too. These supermarkets waste a hell of a lot of food just so they can have a constant supply of food all year round. And what I mean is they have this stupid mentality like you can always get the fruit that you want no matter what time of year it is. You can always walk into a Woolworths or a Coles, for example, and you can always find peaches or apricots, watermelons, plums, whatever it happens to be, not just seasonal items like a greengrocer would have had back in the day. And I think we probably have to go back to that, because who the fuck wants a watermelon in the middle of winter? You know who wants a watermelon in the middle of winter? Fucking sickos. And that's the other problem. We're killing billions of animals a year so we can always have lamb, chicken, beef always stocked. You can't just have chicken wings, you have to have 58 different marinated options, marinated steak. There's too many options. I don't like seafood at supermarkets. There's this pissy little section of seafood in all of the supermarkets I go to, and you can always get seafood year round. You can always get prawns, which are the product of Thailand, and these other fish. I don't like seafood. It stinks. It really puts me off, but it's this obsession with constantly feeding the market rather than telling the market this is what you probably should be eating instead. Maybe you don't need a dragon fruit in the middle of winter because it further strains an already strained system. It's saying to producers like farmers, you need to constantly produce things so people have the option to buy them year round. And I wonder how much of that is wasted. So if you combine the food waste with the moral calamity of having to raise animals, to slaughter them, to feed people, in a system where you need constant deliveries because there's only 1 to 2 days shelf life on most of these products, or 3 to 5, it puts a massive demand on the growers and producers, and then an even further strain on the transport side of things. I mean, how many tons of fuel are used to transport watermelons? I'm using watermelons as an example. They're big, they're heavy. You've got to grow them in a warm climate, I guess. And then you've got to transport them all over the world, even if it's the middle of fucking winter. It makes no sense walking into a Coles or a Woolworths in fucking Tasmania in the middle of June and buying a watermelon. It's fucking stupid. Now, I draw the line with bananas because bananas are a superfood. They're very good for you. You should eat them every day. Bananas, apples, pears are the staples, I think, in the fruit world you should have. But you don't need more exotic things. You don't need like fucking lychees and dragon fruit and mangoes in the middle of winter. Seasonal things should stay seasonal, which would lessen the pressures on the supply chain. Because in winter you're paying more for a mango than you would in summer because it's just not as abundant, or it has to be imported from the other side of the world, which means it has to come in a cold container from, I don't know, South America or Asia or somewhere like that. It needs to be put on a cargo ship for weeks in cold storage. It needs to be exposed to potential harmful chemicals or contamination through workers or accidents or whatever. Transported to the other side of the world where it's taken off the ship, put onto a truck, it's taken to another cold storage facility or distribution center where it sits for another week before it gets delivered. It just seems like the entire modern food supply chain is very inefficient. Well, it's efficient on one hand in terms of cost, but in the scale of environmental responsibility and morality, it's pretty fucked. And I think with some tweaking and management, it could be a much more efficient and resilient system. Short disruptions have already demonstrated how quickly shelves can empty. During the COVID-19 panic buying of 2020, which we all remember that, I know I do, supermarkets across Australia saw toilet paper disappear within hours, which I still struggle to understand. Toilet paper disappear within hours, which I still think is the most retarded thing the human race has ever done. Canned foods rapidly depleted, pasta and rice shelves empty, I remember that. The supply chain itself was still functioning. Yeah, I remember just seeing people buying bags of pasta and rice. I remember going to Aldi to just get a bag of pasta because I was actually cooking pasta. That weekend I went to get 2 bags of penne and there wasn't a fucking single bag of pasta on the shelf at all. And you look around at other people's trolleys and they've got like 5 and 10 bags of pasta each, and some of the pasta's only like 89 cents. I remember seeing that one guy that I've mentioned before with like 10 packets of mints. I went to buy mints, there was none left because this cunt had brought them all. I wanted a fucking Van Damme flying snap kick the cunt in the car park. The issue was simply demand spikes overwhelming short-term inventory. If transport were disrupted at the same time, the situation could become much more serious. Yeah, interesting. So during the panic buying years, the issue wasn't the supply, the issue was short-term inventory, i.e. not being able to restock the shelves of supermarkets quick enough. What we're facing in 2026 is, I guess, the opposite. We can't get the diesel for the transport industry to deliver the food, which I think is, it's obviously much more dangerous in the long term and much more concerning. The distribution centre bottleneck. Most food in Australia flows through large regional distribution centres before reaching stores. Major supermarket chains operate only a small number of massive warehouses that supply entire metropolitan regions. For example, one large distribution centre can supply hundreds of supermarkets. That creates efficiency, but it also creates centralised points of failure. If a distribution centre cannot operate because of power loss, labour disruption, fuel shortages, transportation breakdown, the impact spreads quickly across the retail network. The trucking dependency. Supermarkets rely on continuous truck deliveries. A typical large supermarket may receive 10 to 30 truck deliveries per day. Yeah, interesting. That's a fucking lot. These trucks deliver produce, meat, dairy, frozen goods, packaged goods. Remove the trucks and the store inventories drop rapidly. How quickly could shelves empty? If delivery stopped entirely, estimates suggest within 24 hours fresh produce would begin disappearing. That's very concerning. Within 48 to 72 hours, many supermarket shelves start emptying. Within a week, serious food shortages appear in major urban areas. And I'm predicting within a week and a half, 2 weeks, people are resorting to cannibalism. That's fucked, and it should terrify everybody. If our food supply chain can only sustain a week of disruptions, at the bare minimum, we are fucked. What does week 3 and 4 look like? The system simply isn't built to store months of supply. Modern cities don't store food, they stream it. Every day, thousands of trucks move food into Australian cities. If those trucks stop rolling, the shelves start emptying almost immediately. So this brings up the big and most concerning question. What happens if fuel imports stop? Most of that fuel arrives by tanker ships through global supply chains. If those shipments stopped arriving because of war, shipping disruption, or geopolitical crises, the effects wouldn't be immediate collapse, but they would cascade through the economy, and they would happen faster than many people might expect. So I did some conversing with chat to see theoretically what might happen if this situation was to play out. So day 1 to 2, you'd have panic buying. The first reaction would likely be consumer behaviour, as we saw during the pandemic. Drivers rush to fuel stations, fuel retailers begin reporting supply concerns. What happens next is pretty predictable. People start filling vehicles, spare containers, and anything else which could be used to store fuel in. Exactly this pattern occurred during the United Kingdom fuel crisis of 2021, where panic buying emptied stations even though fuel still existed in the system. And a few weeks ago, this is what we started to see happen in Australia. Within a short period, many petrol stations began to run dry, queues appear at remaining stations, and rationing may begin. Day 3 to 4, logistic stress. Australia's freight network is heavily dependent on diesel. Trucks move roughly 90% of domestic freight. As fuel supplies tighten, freight companies prioritise essential deliveries, non-essential shipments slow or stop, such as online shopping orders. If the post office can't get diesel, then letters and communications, packages and parcels also start to slow, which is also very concerning, especially if you own an online business like me. Fuel prices surge, supermarkets begin receiving fuel deliveries, distribution networks start triaging supply. Would you never want to hear that word in the modern day, triaging anything, because that is not fucking good. Day 5 to 7, food supply pressure. At this point, the effects begin appearing on store shelves. Cities depend on daily food deliveries. Without steady trucking, fresh produce becomes scarce, dairy deliveries fall, meat supplies drop, items that spoil quickly disappear fast. Supermarkets start limiting purchases of key items. This is similar to patterns we've seen during the COVID-19 pandemic, when panic buying temporarily overwhelmed supply chains, and it doesn't seem the world has learned anything from it. It hasn't strengthened the supply chains to make them more resilient to global events, having very damaging impacts on these supply chains. It's almost like the world just said, well, that crisis is done, let's just pretend it didn't happen and let's just go about things how we always have. And I think we are at this point now in history where we are at another event, and I think these events will continue to happen. It may be in shorter frequencies because, like I said, the geopolitical situation in the world is unpredictable, especially when you have fuckwit leaders who are playing God. So I think we will see more conflict and global issues happen in the coming years, which is not really the most encouraging thing, considering this is supposed to be the generation of peace and love and learning to tolerate people for the differences. But in this case, the issue would not be demand. It would be transport capacity. Week 2, economic slowdown. With fuel shortages spreading, transport companies begin parking vehicles, and this has actually happened in Australia. There is a local trucking company that has basically parked its fleet because it's too expensive to operate. There's other transport companies too that are reporting people are breaking into the depot and siphoning diesel out of trucks because they can't get it, or they're selfish cunts that just want to hoard it. They say they're not noticing the 10 to 20 to even 40 litres of diesel disappearing. It's when they take like 100 litres of diesel out of a truck that they notice that something is wrong. Industries that depend on diesel slow dramatically: construction, mining, agriculture, and manufacturing. And this has a massive effect on airlines. Airlines would reduce or cancel flights because jet fuel supplies tighten, which means you could potentially get stranded in countries you were visiting, or you can't fly interstate to see loved ones or attend weddings, things like that. So the things we are taking for granted, our freedom to travel and explore, might be taken away. We might get into a situation where we have to walk to the shops or buy bikes. I'm surprised bike sales haven't skyrocketed, because it seems that all the media talks about now is, many buyers are turning to electric vehicles. So these people are complaining that petrol costs too much because they have to pay an extra $50 or whatever, or for a small car it might cost $60 to fill it up. Now it costs $90. A bigger car like a 4-wheel drive, I don't know, $100 to $300 depending on what it is. So these drivers are complaining they're spending more money and that the search rate of electric vehicles has gone up. Everyone's looking for electric vehicles apparently. But if you were complaining about the price of petrol and you couldn't afford the petrol, it stands to reason you don't have enough money to go buy an electric car. I don't have enough money to buy a brand new petrol-powered car, let alone a fucking electric car. I just love how the media reduces everything to the lowest common denominator and makes it completely fucking black and white and retarded sounding. Like people are going to just get rid of their petrol cars, whether they're just all going to line up at the beach and push them into the fucking ocean and just go buy electric cars, because wouldn't that also have a massive detriment on the supply chain, because the ships that are taking the electric cars from the plants overseas to the dealerships, guess what they rely on? Diesel. Ships are like trains. They do have batteries and they are a bit of a hybrid, but they still rely on diesel. You still need to put them on car carriers. They can only carry maybe like 8 to maybe 10 vehicles if it's a big one, probably less than that, probably 6 to 8 vehicles. That truck needs diesel to get to the Tesla dealership or the BYD dealership to deliver the electric car, so some whinger can go buy it. Electric cars still run on electricity, and that's going to put more of a drain on the already strained energy infrastructure in this country. We're relying on this hybrid model of renewables and, I guess, coal, but it's not enough. We need more power in this country. So I don't think just getting electric cars are the answer, because they can't make the distances required for interstate travel in most cases, and there's not enough of those fueling stations at the moment. And look, it takes a couple of minutes to fill your car up. It takes a couple of hours to charge your battery, and there's a lot of variables that go into that. Temperature and speed and conditions play a part in petrol-driven cars being more efficient. You can be on a highway sitting on 100 kilometers an hour and use less fuel than you would if you were driving around the city. I don't think there's enough data on electric vehicles. If conditions affect the batteries, such as heat, do the batteries degrade over time? I'm assuming it's just like an iPhone. They probably get worse over time and degrade and don't hold a charge as much. Maybe that 100%, like your iPhone, when you charge it up, it doesn't quite get to 100% anymore, it gets to 99%, and then you turn it on, you do a few things, and all of a sudden it's at 70%. Are electric cars the same? Do they not hold the charge? Do they become less powerful? If you're stopping and starting or driving faster, is it going to use more battery more quickly? If you have the radio on, does that drain the battery faster? There's a lot of things to consider. Yeah, I love how the media just says, everyone's looking at electric cars now. Most people can't afford them. Public transport may begin reducing services in diesel-dependent regions. That one's pretty scary. Freight bottlenecks appear across the economy. Week 3, systematic pressure. By this point, the broader economy feels the impact. Agriculture faces immediate operational challenges. Without diesel, tractors cannot operate, harvesters cannot collect crops, and irrigation pumps stop. Food that exists in fields cannot reach markets. Meanwhile, logistics companies struggle to maintain distribution networks. Government intervention would likely begin prioritising fuel allocation for emergency services, food transport, medical supply chains, and defence operations. That should scare the shit out of everybody. Strategic vulnerability. Modern economies are deeply dependent on continuous energy supply. Fuel powers transportation networks, agriculture supply chains, and emergency services. When fuel supply is disrupted, the effects spread quickly because the modern system is highly optimized but not heavily buffered. Modern civilization as we know it runs on fuel. The trucks that move our food, the machines that grow it, the ships that import it, the planes that connect the country, they all rely on the same energy system, oil. When that system works, everything feels effortless, but if it stops, it's just like electricity. You know, those moments when you have a blackout, you're like, oh yeah, I can go a day without power. You realize you can't really go more than 5 minutes to an hour without it before it becomes inconvenient. Even briefly, the fragility of the system becomes very clear. It makes me think of our ancestors, how they survived in a world without power and oil. I think we've made ourselves vulnerable. We've made ourselves more vulnerable than we really need to be by becoming over-reliant on systems that aren't resilient and can be very fragile. Supply chains are like the power, as I just mentioned. They're great when they work, but when there's a disruption or an outage, everything falls apart. Strategic vulnerabilities, the systems we depend on. When you zoom out, what emerges isn't just a story about fuel or farming or trucking, it's a story about how modern civilizations actually function. Modern societies are built on interconnected systems. Energy powers those systems, and when energy flows smoothly, those systems appear invisible. But remove that energy even temporarily, and the dependency becomes obvious. And we're at this point now, and I think the dependency we are facing at the moment is pretty obvious. Oil remains the dominant fuel for global transport. According to the International Energy Agency, oil still powers the overwhelming majority of transport systems worldwide. Despite advances in renewable energy, these sectors remain heavily dependent on liquid fuels. I don't quite buy one of those, what the Labour Minister said on Sunrise the other morning, about, there's plenty of electric trucks around Sydney. Is there? I haven't seen too many around my area. I haven't seen too many long-haul trucks that are powered by batteries. So I guess these all have to do. She said that a couple of weeks before this happened. So what is the other major challenge Australia faces? Australia faces a unique strategic situation. The country is geographically isolated and relies heavily on maritime supply chains. Fuel imports travel thousands of kilometres through global shipping routes before reaching Australian ports, which is kind of weird when you think about it, because you need fuel to transport the fuel to fuel a country that relies heavily on fuel, specifically imported fuel. How many more times can I say fuel? And I guess that is the biggest challenge with Australia, is its geographical location, especially in relation to major oil suppliers throughout the world. And look, a lot of people, me included, are saying, well, the war in the Middle East doesn't have anything to do with us. We don't get a lot of our oil from the Middle East. But I guess the fuel that we do buy relies heavily on Middle Eastern oil. Key routes pass through strategic choke points such as the Strait of Hormuz and the Strait of Malacca. These narrow passages carry large portions of the world's oil supply. Any disruption in these regions, whether through conflict, piracy, or geopolitical tension, can affect global energy markets. Over the past several decades, economies have become increasingly optimized for efficiency. Companies reduce costs by minimizing inventory, outsourcing production, relying on global shipping networks, consolidating logistics infrastructure. This model produced cheaper goods and highly efficient supply chains. But when you really think about it, they are kind of counterintuitive to a lot of Western governments' obsession with net zero and going green, because so much global supply does rely on diesel and massive transport ships and trains and trucks. Until the trucks, trains and ships go green, I don't think these politicians are in really any position to lecture everyday people about how evil they are because they drive a car to work, when basically most of the Western supply chain does come from overseas. But it also created a system that depended on constant movement. If transportation slows, supply chains quickly feel the impact. Energy and national security. Energy security has long been considered a strategic priority. Countries like the US, Japan, South Korea maintain large strategic petroleum reserves specifically to buffer supply shocks. They're the countries that are doing things right, and Australia is chasing its tail in that area. These reserves are designed to ensure that critical systems continue operating during global disruptions. Energy security is therefore not just about economics, it's about resilience, the fragility of complex systems. Modern societies rely on systems that are efficient, globalized, tightly interconnected, but complex systems can also become fragile. Small disruptions can cascade when supply chains are tightly coupled. Inventories are minimal, logistics networks depend on constant movement. Energy sits at the center of that system. This isn't about predicting disaster, it's about understanding the systems we depend on. Most people rarely think about where their fuel comes from, how food reaches supermarkets, how supply chains operate, because when systems function smoothly, they remain invisible. Oil moves the ships, ships move the fuel, fuel moves the trucks, trucks move the food. And food keeps cities alive. Pull on any of those threads, and you begin to see just how much of the modern world depends on systems most of us never even think about. Me being the conspiracy realist that I am, when the conflict in Iran started, one of the first things I thought was who benefits from the surge in oil prices. When oil prices spike, most people experience it the same way: higher fuel prices, higher food prices, and higher transport costs. But while consumers and businesses feel the squeeze, other players in the system can benefit enormously. Oil markets redistribute wealth very quickly when prices surge, and history shows that some groups gain dramatically. Now, the most obvious beneficiaries of this are oil-producing countries. When global prices rise, every barrel they sell becomes more valuable. These major exporters include Saudi Arabia, Russia, United Arab Emirates, and Kuwait. For these nations, oil exports often fund government budgets, infrastructure, sovereign wealth funds, military spending. A price jump of $60 to $100 per barrel can translate into tens of billions of dollars in additional national revenue. That's why oil price movements are not just economic events, they are geopolitical ones. Major oil companies, large energy companies, also benefit significantly when prices rise, such as ExxonMobil, Chevron, BP, and Shell plc. Oil companies invest billions to find and develop oil fields. Once those fields are producing, higher prices can dramatically increase profit margins, and we all know these oil companies don't want this war to end because they are making billions of dollars of extra revenue every single day. For example, after the global energy shock triggered by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, several major oil companies reported record annual profits. When prices rise, companies already producing oil often see their revenues surge without increasing production. Another group that benefits from volatility are the global commodity trading houses, such as Vitol, Glencore, and Trafigura. These firms specialize in buying, transporting, and selling oil and energy products right around the world. Periods of disruption, war sanctions, and supply shocks create opportunities for traders to profit from price differences across markets. In volatile energy markets, trading firms can generate billions in profits from arbitrage and supply movements. Oil price spikes also benefit investors who hold energy assets, including hedge funds, pension funds, private investors, political figures with energy investments, Trump allegedly. When oil prices climb, energy stocks and commodity futures often rise. And apparently, I'm not 100% sure on this, apparently Barron Trump made like $55 million because he brought oil when it was down or something like that. And I guarantee you Trump would be making some money through one of his companies. I know the president can't make money or make excess money or something while he's in office, but you can guarantee his fucking family would be, as well as his business associates. You know those pricks would be absolutely raking in the cash. And those oil companies, apparently they made like $1 billion in profit in a single day because of the surge in the oil price. Political leaders themselves can sometimes have financial exposure through investment portfolios, although the exact gains vary widely and are rarely tied to a single price event. I 100% believe that the corrupt pieces of shit that run the world, all these politicians would have investments in oil. They know when the bombs are going to drop, like allegedly. In the case of Trump, I'm not saying he did this or didn't, I'm just using him as an example. He could tell his investor friends or other people in politics who have stocks in oil companies, don't sell your stock tomorrow because we're going to drop the bombs on Iran. And then there's going to be a ceasefire agreement, and then that's going to send the price down, and then you sell then. But we're going to be bombing them in a couple of weeks' time, so the market will come back up. And these are the same people who made it illegal to prosecute people in politics for insider trading. Nancy Pelosi did that a couple of years ago. I mean, she's apparently supposed to make maybe $100,000 a year as basically a civil servant, but she's clearing $50 million through her stock market investments. Her husband works for some stock company or something. He's allegedly probably insider trading. She has that knowledge and she passes it down to her political cronies, and they make millions of dollars, and then they change the law so they can't be prosecuted, and they laugh and simultaneously piss in everybody else's face. Because if anyone else did that, they would be going to jail for insider trading and breaking the fucking law. I guess it doesn't apply to these people because they believe they are God. Now we come down to the historical example, the 1973 oil crisis. The clearest historical example of oil price power came during the 1973 oil crisis. In October 1973, members of OPEC imposed an oil embargo on countries that supported Israel during the Yom Kippur War. The result was immediate. Global oil prices quadrupled in a matter of months. This is a situation that can happen again. The effects were dramatic. Fuel shortages in Western countries, long lines at petrol stations, inflation across global economies, major wealth transfers to oil-producing states. Oil exporters saw revenues surge. Meanwhile, importing nations experienced economic slowdowns and inflation. And I think that is what's going to happen here in Australia, unfortunately. The crisis reshaped global energy policy for decades. Countries began building strategic reserves and rethinking their dependence on imported oil. The bigger picture. Oil price spikes don't just raise fuel prices. They redistribute power and wealth. They shift money toward oil exporters, energy companies, commodity traders, and energy investors, and push money away from consumers, transport industry, farmers, and manufacturers, because energy sits at the foundation of modern economy. And when its price changes, everything above it moves too. Oil isn't just a commodity, it's a leverage. When prices spike, wealth shifts across the global system from consumers to importers, towards producers and energy markets. During the oil crisis of 1973, a similar situation played out. Oil stopped becoming a commodity and it became a weapon. In October of 1973, the Middle East erupted into war. Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack against Israel during the Jewish holiday of Yom Kippur, triggering what became known as the Yom Kippur War. As the war escalated, the United States began supplying weapons and military support to Israel. The response from the Arab oil-producing states was swift and strategic. Rather than attacking the United States militarily, they targeted its energy supply. The Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, particularly the Arab members, announced an oil embargo against countries supporting Israel, which included the United States and the United Kingdom, as well as several Western allies. Overnight, the most powerful economies in the world discovered something very uncomfortable. Their entire industrial system ran on oil they didn't control. The result was economic shock. Fuel shortages appeared within weeks, petrol stations ran dry, governments imposed rationing, which I think will most likely happen here in the coming months. For the first time in modern history, oil producers demonstrated that energy supply could be weaponized just as effectively as armies or missiles. And the price impact was enormous. Oil prices quadrupled in just a few months. Before the crisis, global oil prices were a measly $3 per barrel. After the embargo, prices surged to $12 per barrel by 1974. That's roughly a 300 to 400% increase in less than a year. In 1973, the world consumed roughly 56 million barrels per day. OPEC controlled about 55% of global oil exports. This gave the cartel enormous leverage. Major producers included Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iran, and Iraq, and the United Arab Emirates. Arab producers reduced output by roughly 5 million barrels per day, which represented about which represented around 9% of global supply. That sounds small on the surface, but oil demand is extremely inelastic. Even a 2 to 3% shortage can trigger major price spikes. So what were the real-world effects of this? Were immediate and dramatic. Fuel rationing, countries introduced emergency measures in the United States, petrol stations closed on Sundays, fuel purchases were limited by license plate numbers, national speed limits introduced to reduce consumption, the famous odd-even fuel rationing system appeared, meaning if you had odd numbers in your license plate, you could only fill up on certain days, and vice versa. The oil crisis triggered severe global inflation, recession across Western economies, stock market crashes, the beginning of the 1970s stagflation era. Global GDP growth collapsed from roughly 6% in the early 1970s to near zero in many countries. The crisis forced Western countries to rethink energy security. The International Energy Agency was created in 1974. Countries began building emergency stockpiles. The US Strategic Petroleum Reserve eventually stored up to 714 million barrels of oil, specifically for crisis situations. Western countries accelerated development of new oil regions, including North Sea fields in the UK and Norway, the Alaska North Slope, and the Gulf of Mexico. These discoveries reshaped global energy markets in the following decades. So what is the big lesson from the 1973 oil crisis? If anything, the 1973 crisis demonstrated something that remains true today. Energy dependency equals strategic vulnerability. If a country relies on imported fuel to run its transport, agriculture, industry, and military, then the countries controlling that fuel supply hold enormous leverage. And that's exactly why energy security is still one of the most important and least discussed geopolitical issues in the world. For most people, the price of fuel is just a number on a sign at the petrol station. It goes up, it goes down, and we complain about it on the drive home. And I think what happened in 1973 is destined to repeat. I think we will see rationing, maybe not so much odds and evens, but I think fuel rationing is destined to come in if we don't lock down the fuel supply, especially in Australia, very, very soon. We just simply can't survive because we don't have a strategic fuel supply, which is alarming. And what happens if a country like Singapore, where we do get most of our fuel from, says, no, we're going to keep it ourselves because we're running out? They do need a lot of our natural gas, so we do have a slight bargaining chip, but at the end of the day, the oil price is going up, the gas price isn't. And they can easily get natural gas from another country. There's plenty of countries that produce it, not quite the quantities that Australia does, but there are other regions that do produce natural gas. Oil is the more valuable commodity at the moment, and that might come back to bite Australia in a big way in the coming months. I hope not. I hope all this sorts itself out, the ceasefire holds, and we can all go back to normal, but I don't think we're going to be that lucky. I don't quite believe the US or the Iranian side of things. One side says the other didn't say that, and the other one said this, and then you have Netanyahu bombing the shit out of Lebanon. The world isn't getting better, and I think the fuel crisis is going to get worse. But behind that number is a system most people never see. Australia once refined most of its own fuel. Today we import the majority of it. With much of our petrol and diesel refined overseas and shipped thousands of kilometres before it ever reaches Australian shores. Our transport network, trucks, agriculture, aviation, mining and food distribution all depend entirely on that steady flow of imported fuel. So when oil prices spike, it doesn't just hit motorists, it ripples through everything. Transport costs rise, farming becomes more expensive, food distribution tightens, and the price increases more through the entire economy. And that raises the obvious question. If Australia doesn't get most of its oil from the Middle East, why do conflicts there still send prices soaring? That answer is simple. Oil is a global market. Prices are set internationally, shaped by supply, shocks, geopolitical tensions, and financial markets. Even if the fuel in your tank was refined in Singapore, the price was still influenced by what happens in the Persian Gulf. We've seen this before. During the 1973 oil crisis following the Yom Kippur War, oil producers used energy as a geopolitical weapon. Prices quadrupled in a matter of months, and the global economy was thrown into chaos. More than 50 years later, the lesson is still the same. Energy supply isn't just an economic issue, it's a strategic one. And this brings up the age-old question, who really benefits from this situation and who's paying for it? It's not the average everyday consumer. They're the ones getting fucked by a rhino at the Bowser, not the billionaires. And that brings us to the end of part 2 of the Iran conflict, oil, bread and circus. I hope you all liked it and got something out of it and learnt a valuable lesson about the oil crisis and how the oil industry works. I didn't know any of this before I started researching this episode, so I'm probably as shocked as you are. If you like to support the Truth Tank, there's a couple of things you can do. You can head on over to the Facebook and Instagram page, give them a follow and a like. You can download and listen to your favourite episodes on Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon, Audible, YouTube, Castbox, Podbean, iHeartRadio, Pandora, or wherever else you get your podcasts from. You can buy me a coffee. Just hit the link in the description. You can donate whatever you like. You can make reoccurring payments if you want to support the podcast and the work I'm doing. If you get the time, why don't you head on over to the brand new Truth Tank store over on Spring. Pick yourself up some wearable truth. You'll be supporting the show and looking really good doing it. Tell your friends, tell your family, tell anyone you think might like the show. Help spread the word and get the Truth Tank out there. If you really want to see the show grow, why don't you consider leaving a 5-star rating and review on your preferred podcast player or all of them. Each review helps the show grow and get found. And I'll be back in the next week or two with a brand new episode. But until then, I'm Atang. This is the truth. Truth to tell.